Buttercup's Baby. An Explanation. You're probably wondering why I only abridged the first chapter. The answer is simple. I was not allowed to do more. The following explanation is kind of personal, and I'm sorry for putting you through it. Some of this, more than some, a lot, was painful when it happened. Still is, as I write it down for you. I don't come out all that well a lot of the time, but that can't be helped. Morgenstern was always honest with his audience. I don't think I can be any less with you. My troubles began 25 years ago with the reunion scene. You remember, in my abridgment of The Princess Bride, when Buttercup and Westley have been reunited just before the fire swamp, I stuck my 2 cents in and said I thought Morgenstern had cheated his readers by not including a reunion scene for the lovers, so I'd written my own version and send in if you want a copy. Page 171 to 72 in this edition. My late great editor, Hiram Hayden, felt I was wrong, that if you abridge someone, you can't suddenly start using your own words. But I liked my reunion scene a lot. So, to humor me, he let me stick that note in the book about sending in for it. No one, please believe this, no one thought anyone would actually request my version. But Harcourt, the original hardcover publisher, got deluged, and later Ballantine, the paperback publisher, got deluged even more. I loved that. Publishers having to spend money. My reunion scene was poised for mailing, but not one was ever sent. What follows is the explanatory letter I wrote that was mailed to tens of thousands of people who had written in over the years asking for the scene. Dear reader, thank you for sending in, and no, this is not the reunion scene, because of a certain roadblock named Kermit Shogg. As soon as bound books were ready, I got a call from my lawyer, Charlie. You may not remember, but Charlie's the one I called from California to go down in the blizzard and buy The Princess Bride from the used book dealer. Anyway, he usually begins with Talmudic humor, wisdom jokes, only this time he just says, "Bill, I think you better get down here." And before I'm even allowed why, he adds, "Right away if you can." Panicked, I zoomed down, wondering who could have died. Did I flunk my tax audit? What? His secretary lets me into his office, and Charlie says, "This is Mr. Shogg, Bill." And there he is, sitting in the corner, hands on his briefcase, looking exactly like an oily version of Peter Lorre. I really expected him to say, "Give me the falcon, you must, or I will be forced to kill you." Mr. Shogg is a lawyer, Charlie goes on, and this next was said underlined. He represents the Morgenstern estate. Who knew? Who could have dreamed such a thing existed? An estate of a man dead at least 1,000,000 years that no one ever heard of over here anyway. "Perhaps you will give me the falcon now," Mr. Shogg said. That's not true. What he said was, "Perhaps you will like a few words with your client alone now." And Charlie nodded, and out he went, and once he was done, I said, "Charlie, my God, I never figured—" And he said, "Did Harcourt?" And I said, "Not that they ever mentioned." And he said, "Ooch," the grunting sound lawyers make when they know they've backed a loser. "What does he want?" I said. "A meeting with Mr. Jovanovich," Charlie answered. It turned out that Kermit Shogg did not just want a meeting with William Jovanovich, the brilliant man who ran the firm. He also wanted amazing amounts of money, and he also wanted the unabridged, The Princess Bride version, printed with a huge first printing, 100,000. And, of course, the idea of little me sending out the reunion scene died that day. But the lawsuits began. Over the years, a grand total of 13, only 11 directly concerning me. It was horrible. But the one good thing was that the copyright on Morgenstern ran out in '78. So I told everyone who sent in for the reunion scene that their names were being put on a list and kept, and once 78 rolled around, voila! But I was wrong again. Here is part of the next note I sent out to all people requesting the reunion scene. I'm really sorry about this, but you know the story that ends, disregard previous wire, letter follows. Well, you've got to disregard the business about the Morgenstern copyright running out in 78. That was definitely a boo-boo, but Mr. Shogg, being Florinese, has trouble, naturally, with our numbering system. The copyright runs out in 87, not 78. Worse, he died. Mr. Shogg, I mean. Don't ask how you could tell. It was easy. One morning he just stopped sweating, so there it was. What makes it worse is that the whole affair is now in the hands of his kid, named, wait for it, Mandrake Shogg. Mandrake moves with all the verve and speed of a lizard flaked out on a riverbank. The only good thing that's happened in this whole mess is I finally got a shot at reading some of Buttercup's Baby. Up at Columbia, they feel it's definitely superior to The Princess Bride in satirical content. Personally, I don't have the emotional attachment to it, but it's a hell of a story, no question. It's funny, looking back, but at the time, I had really zero interest in Buttercup's Baby. Many reasons, but among them this. I was writing my own novels then. To make sense of that, I suppose I ought to tell you what I did with The Princess Bride. I know the book cover just says abridged by, and yes, I jumped from good part to good part. But it was really a good deal more than that. Morgenstern's The Princess Bride is a 1,000-page manuscript. I got it down to 300. But I didn't just cut out his satiric interludes. I made elisions constantly, and there was all kinds of stuff, some of it wonderful, I got rid of. Example, Westley's terrible childhood and how he came to be the farm boy. Example, how the king and queen went to Miracle Max because they knew they had somehow given birth to a monster. Humperdinck. And could Max change that? Max's failure is what led to his firing, which in turn caused his crisis in confidence. His wife Valerie refers to it when she says to Inigo, "He's afraid he's done, that the miracles are gone from his once majestic fingers." Page 278 in this version. I felt all this, exciting and moving, as a lot of it is, to be off the spine of the story. I went with true love and high adventure, and I think I was right to do that. And I think the results have proved that. Morgenstern never had any audience for his book, except in Florin, of course. I brought it to people everywhere, and, with the movie, to a wider audience still. So, sure, I abridged it. But, I'm sorry, I shaped it. I also brought it to life. I don't know what you want to call that, but whatever I did, it's sure something. So, Buttercup's Baby was just not for me at that time. The workload was one thing. It would have meant thousands of hours of labor. But that was nothing compared to the constant attacks by the Shoggs. Lawsuit after awful lawsuit, and each time I had to defend myself, had to give depositions, which I frankly found hateful, because they were all attacks on my honesty. I had had, then, enough of Mr. Morgenstern for a while. I didn't actually read Buttercup's Baby, either. I happened to be at Columbia University one afternoon. I gave my papers to Columbia, and some Florinese kid stopped by, handed me a rough translation to glance at. The full title of the book is this: Buttercup's Baby, S. Morgenstern's Glorious Examination of Courage Matched Against the Death of the Heart. Had a great opening page, a real shocker, but that was mostly what I remember. It was just another book to me then, you see. It had not become lodged in my heart. Yet. So, what changed things? To tell you the truth, and I might as well, My life the last dozen years has been, how can I put it, what's the reverse of giddy? Oh, I've written plenty of screenplays and some non-fiction, but I haven't written a novel. And please remember that that's painful for me, because in my heart that's what I am, a novelist. A novelist who happens to write screenplays. I hate it when I sometimes meet people and they say, "Well, when's the next book coming out?" And I always make a smile and lie that I'm on the home stretch now. And the movies I've been involved with, except for Misery, have all brought their share of disappointment. I live alone here in New York, in a nice hotel, room service, 24 hours. All that's great, but I feel sometimes that whatever I wrote once that maybe had some quality, well, maybe those days are gone. But to balance the bad, there was always my son Jason. You all remember how when he was 10, he was this humorless blimp, this waddler? Well, that was his thin phase. Helen and I used to fight about it all the time. He had just passed 300 biggies when he turned 15. I'd come home from work early, hollered my presence, was heading for the wine closet, when I heard this heartbreaking sound, sobbing, coming from the kid's room. I took a breath, went to his door, knocked. Jason and I were not close at this point. The truth is, he didn't care for me all that much. He barely acknowledged my existence, pissed on the movies I wrote, never dreamed of opening any of the books. It killed me, of course, but I never let on. "Jason," I said from just outside his door. The awful sobbing continued. "What is it?" "You can't help. No one can help. Nothing can help." And then this forlorn, wah. I knew the last person he wanted to see was me, but I had to go in. "I promise I won't tell anybody." He came rolling into my arms, his face fiery, distorted. "Oh, Daddy, I'm ugly and I've got no friends, and all the girls laugh at me and make fun because I'm so fat." I had to blink back tears myself, because it was all true, you see. I was trapped there in that moment. I didn't know if he wanted to hear the truth from me or not. Finally, I had to say it. "Who cares?" I told him. "I love you." He grabbed me so hard. "Papa," he managed. "Papa." The first blessed time he ever called me that, his hot tears fresh on my skin. That was our turning point. For the past 20 years, no one could have asked for a better son. More than that, Jason's the best friend I have in the world. But our real clincher happened the next day. I took him down to the Strand bookstore on Broadway and 12th Street, where I go a lot, research mostly, and we were about to enter when he stopped and pointed to a photograph in the window, the front cover of a book of photographs. "I wonder who that is," Jason said, staring. "He's an Austrian bodybuilder, trying to make it as an actor. I met him when I was in L.A. last. He wants to be Fezzik if The Princess Bride ever happens." This was the late 70s now, 20 years back. Schwarzenegger was nothing then. But when The Princess Bride did finally happen, he was such a huge star we couldn't afford him in our budget. I liked him. Very bright young guy. Jason could not take his eyes off the picture. Then I said what I guessed turned out to be the magic words. "He was pudgy once, too." Jason looked at me then. "I don't think so," he said. I didn't think so either, but it didn't hurt to say it. "It came up in conversation," I said. "He said he thought he had gone as far in the bodybuilding world as he could. What drove him was he didn't like the way he looked when he was young. An aside about Arnold, which I bet you didn't know, he was friends with Andre the Giant. I guess strong guys all know each other. Following is a story he told me. I used it in the obit I wrote when Andre, alas, died. Andre once invited Schwarzenegger to a wrestling arena in Mexico, where he was performing in front of 25,000 screaming fans. and, after he'd pinned his opponent, he gestured for Schwarzenegger to come into the ring. So, through the noise, Schwarzenegger climbs up. Andre says, "Take off your shirt. They are all crazy for you to take off your shirt. I speak Spanish." So, Schwarzenegger, embarrassed, does what Andre tells him. Off comes his jacket, his shirt, his undershirt, and he begins striking poses. And then Andre goes to the locker room, while Schwarzenegger goes back to his friends. And it had all been a practical joke. God knows what the crowd was screaming for, but it wasn't for Schwarzenegger to semi-strip and pose. Nobody gave a S blank if I took my shirt off or not, but I fell for it. Andre could do that to you. "I wonder how much that picture book is," Jason said then. "We're still outside of the Strand, remember, and we didn't know it, but the Earth has moved. Are you surprised to learn I bought it for him?" This is what happened to Jason in the next 2 years. He went from 308 to 230. He went from 5'6.5" to 6'3". He had always been tops in his class at Dalton, but now, ripped and gorgeous, he was popular too. This is what happened to Jason in the years after that. College, medical school, the decision to be a shrink like his mom. Except Jason's specialty is sex therapy. New York Magazine rated him tops in the city, and he also met this lovely lady Wall Streeter, Peggy Henderson, and they got happily married. And had a son. I went to the hospital as soon as he was born. "We're calling him Arnold," Peggy told me, holding him in her arms. "Perfect," I said. The truth is, obviously, I was hoping they might remember me, too, somehow. But down was down. "That's right," Jason said. "William Arnold." And he took Willie and put him in my arms. High point of my life. For those of you who have not yet thrown the book across the room in frustration, let me explain that this all really does have to do with why only the first chapter of Buttercup's Baby, and I promise to get there so fast you won't believe it. Okay, Willie the kid. Jason and Peggy live only 2 blocks away, and I'm careful not to drive them nuts, but I never had a grandson before. Not a toy at Zatomer's escaped me. Not a cough from him didn't keep me up all night going through my health encyclopedias. I could refuse him, obviously, nothing. Which is why my behavior in the park was so odd. Gorgeous spring day, Peggy and Jason holding hands up ahead, me and 7-year-old Willie tossing a wiffle ball back and forth a step behind. We already go to some weekend Knick games together. I've had season tickets since Hugh B. Brown was sent down to Earth to destroy me. "We have a request," Jason began things. "Guess what we finished last night?" Peggy went on. "The Princess Bride. We took turns reading it out loud." Trying for casual, I asked the youngster what he thought of the entire enterprise. "It was good," Willie replied, "except for the end." "I don't like the end all that much either," I said. "Blame Mr. Morgenstern." No, Peggy explained. "He didn't dislike the ending. He didn't like that it ended." Pause. We walked in silence. "I told him about the sequel, Papa," Jason said then. Peggy nodded. He got really excited. And then my Willie said the words, "Read it to me." I knew at that moment I was losing it. I remember exactly my fear. What if I couldn't bring it to life this time? What if I failed? Failed us both? "That's the request, Dad. Willie wants you to read him Buttercup's Baby. We all want you to do it." "Well, it's too bad about what we all want, isn't it?" I started, my voice too loud. "It's sure too bad we can't have everything, isn't it? You all better get used to disappointment." And before I did anything even worse, I looked at my watch, gestured that I had to go, took off, went home, stayed there, didn't answer the phone, had early Chinese sent in from Pig Heaven, started drinking, was gone by midnight. and woke before dawn with a dream so vivid. I went out to my terrace, paced, started trying to figure out the dream, and more than that, I guess, my life, and how had I screwed it up. It was a memory of that second pneumonia, and Helen was reading the screenplay of the movie to me, only this time she was young and wonderful, and she was also crying. On the terrace I knew why. We are all the writers of our own dreams. She was me. She was me crying for me, for what I had become. And then I remembered she wasn't reading The Princess Bride. She was reading about Fezzik and the madman on the mountain, the start of Buttercup's baby. And I realized that twice I'd almost died, and Morgenstern had come to save me, and now here he was again, saving me again, because I knew this. Standing there, looking out at the city as the sun rose, I would be a real writer once more, not just some schmuck with an Underwood, as screenwriters are still thought of, out there. I didn't think I was ready to go from 0 to 60, to start a novel from scratch. I didn't feel confident that I could make everything up, as I had done for my 30 novel-writing years. Let me explain what I was not ready to do. Take Zell, the Nazi dentist and marathon man. Olivier in the movie, and wasn't he great? Remember the "Is it safe?" scene with the dental tools? There is this street in Manhattan, 47th between 5th and 6th, and I was walking along it one day, decades back, on my way somewhere. Can't remember, doesn't matter, but that block is called the Diamond District. It is filled with an amazing number of diamond shops, most of them run by Jews, and on a lot of them, you could see they still had their concentration camp numbers. I thought that day, what a great scene it might be if I could have a Nazi walking on that street. Which Nazi, I didn't know, but probably I started doing some mild research, reading and asking people, and I finally came across the most brilliant of them all, Mengele, the double doctor, Ph.D. and M.D., then thought to be living in Argentina, the guy who did the heartless experiments on twins. Okay, great, I've got my guy. But why does he risk everything to come to 47th Street? I knew this much. It couldn't be to go to the prom. The most wanted man on earth had to have an unshakable reason. Years go by, with Mengele stuck in the corner of my head, and gradually Babe started to appear, the marathon man of the title. Then I caught a break. I read about a surgeon who had invented a heart sleeve operation somewhere, maybe Cleveland, but I could put him in New York. Yes. Mengele came to America, to New York, because he had to save his life. Brilliant. I am flying for the next little while, because I have solved my most difficult problem, and then it hits me. Fool! What kind of a villain is it who's so frail he needs heart surgery? My God, if someone chased him, he might keel over from the effort. Obviously, a couple of years later, I figured out some things, and wrote the book, and wrote the movie, and the scene that still works best, along with the dental scene, is Zell wandering among the Jews. On the terrace that morning, I knew I wasn't ready to take on that kind of trip. But this shaping of Buttercup's baby was a perfect middle step for me. Bringing it to life, as I had The Princess Bride, would give me the confidence to at last go back to being what I once was. So I would do the abridgment of the sequel, and then do my own novel, and ride off into the friggin' sunset. Thank you very much. Once offices opened for the day, I called Charlie, still my lawyer, and told him that I wanted more than anything on earth to abridge the sequel. And was there any way he thought the Morgenstern estate would put an end to hostilities? He said the most amazing thing. They contacted me today. The Shoggs. Kermit's daughter did. She's a young lawyer for the firm, sounded nice and bright, and let me quote her. "We want to settle for peace with your Mr. Goldman." Tennessee said it best. Sometimes there's God so quickly. I met Karloff Shog the next morning for breakfast in the dining room of the Carlisle Hotel, none prettier in all New York. Charlie set it up and decided not to be there. No point. This was a look-like, where we would both try on our charm and see if we could do business. So I sat waiting for her to appear. With a name like Karloff Shog, I figured a mustache was a sure bet, and don't even think about her armpits. In case you don't know, and you don't know, nobody knows stuff like this, Karloff is the most popular girl's name in Florin. Make of that what you will. This dreamboat walks in. Mid-30s, dressed to kill, long, loose blonde hair. Gorgeous. She comes right over, and she holds out her hand. "Hi, Carly Shog. This is so great meeting you. You look just like the pictures on your books, only, may I say, younger?" You may say that as loudly and as often as you want. I tend to be a little thick-tongued when sweet young things are around, so that was pretty smooth for me. The nutty thing is, at that moment, when we had met on Earth for all of 10 seconds, I thought she wanted me. Want, in the sense of desire, and if you know me at all, you know I don't think anybody ever wants me. Not once in the sense of desire, anyway. "What brings you to America?" "We're doing a lot of legal stuff in the States now. I just moved here." Now a pause. "Thank God." She looked at me. "I can tell you've never been in Florin." I said I hadn't. "It's a little inbred. I mean, in Florin, if you marry your first cousin, that's considered good." Another pause. "An attempt at humor, sorry." I've dated some terrific women since Helen left me a decade past, but this one here, this blue-eyed lawyer with the body and the brains on any list, was special. She reached across the table, then took my hand. Let me run that by you again. She took my hand, and looked into my eyes and said, "I'm just so glad our legal troubles are done." "It's been awful," I agreed. "I was only sued once before in my whole life, it's true, and that was by an actor, so it doesn't really count." Need I tell you her laugh was bell-like? Then, to only improve her bank account, came this. "You won't believe me, but I've read every novel you've ever written, including the Harry Longbaugh." No Way to Treat a Lady was first published under a pseudonym, Harry Longbaugh, the real name of the Sundance Kid. I'm so in love at this point, it is ridiculous. "The lawsuits your guys filed? You'll drop them?" "Of course, all 13. That's what we're going to do for you, and all we want from you is your goodwill." Goodwill? If I'd have had an engagement ring with me, it would have been hers. "Yes, it's so important that Buttercup's baby be published, here in America." I signaled for coffee, and a waiter poured us some. We fiddled with sweetener and low-fat milk and all that other yummy stuff we do to our stomachs these days. We sipped silently, and we looked at each other. Then I said the nuttiest thing. "How old are you, Carly?" "How old do you want me to be?" "I know all about you. I know you were born at Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago on August 12th, 1931. Pretty good?" I nodded. She opened her purse then. "All you have to know is this, Bill. I broke up with my boyfriend when I left Florin City, and he was 55. I have a thing for—" and here she paused, smiled so sweetly, "for vigorous older men." Mark Antony was never this smitten. She reached into her purse, handed me a piece of paper. "This is just legal boilerplate. Have your lawyer check it out, then sign it and mail it back to me." "What is it?" "It's called settling for peace. We agree to drop all the lawsuits. You agree that we did nothing wrong, and that you wish us the best on all future projects. I do more than wish you well. I'm going to kill myself doing Buttercup's baby." "Of course you would," she said then. "And do you know the most important 6 words in the last 30 years in world culture? I'll tell you what they are. Peter Benchley came up with them when he was walking along a beach, and the words were these: what if the shark got territorial? Because out of that came the novel Jaws, and then the movie Jaws, and nothing's really been the same since. Well, Carly Shogg's next 6 words weren't that important, except, of course, to me. Before she said them, I asked her, "Why did you say, 'Of course you would'? You meant, 'Of course you will.' I'm doing Buttercup's baby." That moment, waiting for her to speak, looking at the glorious lady, at her pale blue eyes, I remember thinking something weird is going on, something bad even. But in no paranoid nightmare could I have come up with what she said next. "Stephen King is doing the abridgment." Here's what I did not say. "What's the punchline?" Here's another. "You're killing me." Or, "He'll laugh right in your face." Try, "You rotten bitch." While I was busy saying nothing, Carly went smartly on. "Here's what we get when you sign that letter. Safety. See, you're nowhere near King in terms of sales. No one is. We don't have to go there. But a lot of people connect you with Morgenstern because of the movie, and what we don't want is people wondering why you decided not to do the sequel. Goodwill is very important, and we can't have you running around claiming betrayal. I wrote this. I think you can live with it." Here's what she put down. "I'm so excited Stephen King has come on board. Frankly, I'm exhausted as far as Mr. Morgenstern is concerned. So I wish everyone the best, and I don't know about you, but I can't wait to read Buttercup's baby." I looked at her a moment before I spoke. She looked like Bela Lugosi now. "He won't do it. King. I know him a little, and there's no reason on earth he'd get dragged into something like this." "Steve doesn't feel he's getting dragged into anything. He's genuinely excited. We talk every day. Will, till everything's finalized." "I don't believe you. I don't know what you're after, but find another buyer." I stood up. "His name wasn't always King," Carly said then. "He has ancestors who lived in Florence City way back when. He still visits in the summertime." I sat back down. "Does he know about me?" "Bill, of course." And I told him just what the peace settlement says, that you're exhausted. "That's easy enough to believe. My God, you haven't written a novel in well over a decade." She now strongly resembled Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. "I'll see you in court," I said, tossing some money on the table, walking out. A stupid and hollow thing to say. She could keep pressuring me with the lawsuits. No question, she had all the cards. All but one. Late the next morning, I was sitting in the airport in Bangor, Maine. I knew King basically from Misery, a screenplay I wrote from one of his best and favorite novels. I'd come up to Bangor a couple of times, just your basic research. Chatting with him, a few questions I thought could be better answered in person than over the phone. We had a sneak for him when the movie was done, and Rob Reiner, the director, and I paced the lobby while it was on, hoping he'd like it. It meant a lot to us to please him. Rob's career really took off with Stand By Me, another work by King, a novella called The Body. We could tell as soon as we saw him walking out that he was happy about what we'd done with his baby. He loved Kathy Bates especially. Not alone in that. She won the Oscar for Best Actress. It's funny, but what I remember even more was the moment before it started when he left us to take his seat. The look on his face was so hopeful, like a kid. I commented on that to Rob, who said, "I think he's as vulnerable now as when he started, which is how he's managed to stay Stephen King." I don't think everyone realizes what a phenomenon he is. It's not just the hundreds of millions of books sold. It's that he has arguably been the hottest writer in the world for so long. Carrie came out in '74, a quarter century sitting closest to the fire. I saw him through the window now. Jeans, lumberjack shirt, shambling walk. King's a lot bigger than you think, and remarkably unpretentious. We sat in a private corner of the waiting room. I hadn't eaten since the legendary lunch the day before with the fiend of Florin, and I'd been up half the night getting everything all set. Just how to say it rationally, novelist to novelist, storyteller to storyteller. And the way it went in my head, I wasn't even halfway through before he said, "Bill, that bitch lied to me. She said you didn't want to do it." I only said I'd get involved because she talked to a bunch of relatives I still have back there, and they put pressure on me, but I felt dragged into the damn thing from the beginning. The silence went on. King looked at me, waiting. I knew I was making him nervous just sitting there, but I couldn't figure how to start. All I knew was I didn't want to embarrass him, or worse, humiliate myself. Finally, he asked, "How's Kathy? I liked her in Titanic." He's giving you a way to start, I told myself. So talk about Kathy Bates. You've got a great Kathy Bates story. Tell him. "I don't see her much, but did I ever tell you how she got the misery part? It's a great story." King shook his head. "I wrote the part for her. I'd seen her on stage for years. She's one of the great actresses, but she'd never gotten her break in films. And before I started, I was talking with Rob, and I said, 'I'm going to write Annie Wilkes for Kathy Bates.' And Rob said, 'Oh, good. She's great. We'll use her.'" "Then what?" King asked. "That was it. The most sought-after female role that year, and it went to this unknown. I loved being part of that, changing a life." "Great story, all right," King said, trying to sound enthusiastic. But I knew his heart wasn't in it. "No," I said, way too loud, but I was not in the best shape, as readers of these pages will have sensed. "No," I repeated, more conversationally. "That's not the story. Here's the great story." King waited. "Okay, so Rob calls her in. Just Kathy and Rob in the room, and she has never come close to a lead in a movie, and Rob just lets it fly. You've got the part." Kathy sits there for a moment before she says this. "The part. I've got it." Rob nods, repeats the news. "You've got it." Now there's another pause before Kathy comes out with this. "The Annie part. Annie Wilkes. That part?" Rob nods again. "Annie Wilkes. The lead." Now a little faster from Kathy. "And I've got it, and it's all set and everything." "All set," from Rob. Now she leans forward a little. "Let me just get this straight. I am playing Annie Wilkes, the lead, in Misery?" "Yep," says Reiner, and Kathy goes on. "It's done and everything. I mean, I'm definitely playing Annie, and that's set and done and everything. No mistakes or anything?" And Rob says, "It is so set you wouldn't believe it." And then there's a moment of silence in the room. And then she says this, "Can I tell my mother?" King just loved it. I do too. It's one of my all-time favorite sweet Hollywood stories. He laughed and smiled and looked at me questioningly, and I raised my right hand and said, "All true, word of honor." And I could feel myself, at last, relaxing. I knew I could do it now, talk to him, convince him not to do the sequel because, after all, I had done The Princess Bride, and, even on this earth, fair was occasionally fair. And he said, "I really liked the movie." I said I did too, not just Kathy, but how about Jimmy Caan? Then he said, "I meant The Princess Bride." "Thanks. So do I." And I was about to go on when I realized something just awful. He hadn't mentioned the novel, just the movie. But, my God, he had to like it. I was just being paranoid. "I wish I felt the same about the novel," he said, and I could see it pained him to say it. The most popular storyteller of the century tells you that you suck as a storyteller. I would like to report I handled the whole thing with maturity. But, alas, what I said, like a total jerk, was, "Yeah? Well, a lot of people liked it just fine, thank you very much." Suddenly he was leaning in toward me. "Bill, the way you caught his style was fine, but the fact is, I don't like a lot of what you did with the abridgment. For example, Chapter 4, you cut out 70 pages on Buttercup's training. How could you do that? There was wonderful stuff in there. You must have seen the Royalty School. It's one of the great buildings left in all of Europe. Buttercup's curriculum is amazing. How could you leave it out?" I was mostly interested in the story, you know, the plot. And that's when I broke it to him. "I never went there. To Florin. What was so important about going?" "What was so important? You flew up here just to check out things for a screenplay adaptation." I didn't say anything then, because I could feel this terrible wind coming, and I knew it would blow me away. "That's why I want to do Buttercup's baby," he said. "Get things right this time." I was dead in the water. I stood, thanked him for his time, started out, devastated. "I'm really sorry," he said. I made a smile. Not the easiest thing for me to pull off at that moment, but I liked King. Didn't want him, of all people, to see me fall apart. He called after me. "Bill, wait. I just had an idea. Listen, I'll do the abridgment, and you can do the screenplay. I'll make that a deal-breaker in my contract." King was trying to be helpful. I understood that. But right there in the airport I told him about my dad reading to me, and Jason not liking it, and me realizing how I had only been read the good parts, and now Jason was me, and he had this kid, Willie, this wonderful child named after me, and Willie wanted me to read it to him, and none of this abridgment business would have happened if I hadn't started it. And what would he do if he ever lost it? His power, storytelling, as I'd lost mine. And how would he like to spend the rest of his life writing perfect parts for perfectly horrible people who happened to be movie stars this week with all that power? And I was what I most didn't want to ever be, humiliated. So I left him there, forcing myself not to run out the door. Gone. The plane back to New York left in 3 hours, and I grabbed a cab, hid in Bangor till it was time, cabbed back to the airport. Late, weather problems. I sat on a bench in the airport, leaned back, closed my eyes until King asked, "You had to come all the way to Maine to have a nervous breakdown?" He was sitting alongside me. "You did make one good point, and I've thought a lot about it. None of this abridgment business would have happened except your dad kept skipping stuff. So, in a way, you're very much right. It is your baby. You began it." Pause. Then he said it. "Try the first chapter." He could tell from my expression that I didn't quite understand what he meant. I guess I was like Kathy talking to Rob. "Look, this is the 25th anniversary year of The Princess Bride, right?" "Your version." It was. "Well, probably your publisher will want to do something, maybe reprint it in hardcover." I nodded. We'd already talked about that. "Well, abridge the first chapter of Buttercup's baby. Include it if you want. You probably ought to write an introduction to the chapter, explaining why you're not doing the whole book. I'll call the Shoggs, tell them my decision. They won't like it, but they'll go along. They've been wanting to be in business with me for years. Florney's rights to my stuff are coming due in the next couple of years." For a moment, then, he hesitated, and I wondered if he was changing his mind. I just waited, hoping not. Next, he shook his head, and there was a look on his face that might have said, "Am I nuts to do this?" Then these wonderful words, "Bill, I expect you to really try this time." "I'll research the hell out of it," I told him, and have I ever. "But what happens after I publish the chapter?" "Let's go one step at a time," he answered. "You write it, I'll read it, Morgenstern's public will read it. I'll send a bunch of copies to all my cousins and Florin, see what they think." He stood, looked at me. "I guess the most important thing is really Morgenstern. He was a master, and it would be nice if we could please him, don't you think?" "That would be best of all," I said, God's truth. We shook hands, said goodbye. He started away, glanced back. "You haven't read Buttercup's Baby yet, have you?" "Not yet." "It's a pretty amazing story." "What are you saying? That even I can't screw it up?" "You got that right," Stephen King said, and he smiled. I left for Florin immediately. I didn't get to Florin immediately, of course. Florin Air's scheduling geniuses saw to that. I took the Air France night flight to Brussels, where you connect with Inter Italia, which lets you out in Gilder, and then just the short hop to Florin City. I'd made out a list of places to see. Royalty School, obviously, because King put such emphasis on it. The Cliffs of Insanity. I phoned ahead and made a booking. The place is insane with visitors now. The forest where the Battle of the Trees took place, on and on. King had given me a list of friends and scholars who he thought might prove helpful. One wonderful cousin ran the best restaurant in Florin. A blessing, because Florin, as you may know, is the root vegetable capital of Europe. Good for their farmers, but rutabaga is their national dish, and you can get sick of it pretty fast unless a skillful cook is around. It was odd, those first days, looking at real places that I thought were made up when I was a kid. I was worried that they might not live up to my fantasies. Some of them didn't. Most of them did. The Thieves' Quarter, where Fezzik reunited with Inigo, I saw that, and the room where Inigo finally killed Count Rugen. It's on the castle tour. Buttercup's farm has been kept pretty much intact. But, what can I tell you, it's a farm. And, of course, the fire swamp is still as deadly as ever. No one's allowed in. But I did see the spot not that far away where local scholars believe that Buttercup and Westley held each other after she pushed him off the cliff. It's where the reunion scene took place, and let me tell you, it was strange, me standing there, looking at that patch of ground. You still can't get to One Tree Island by boat because of the surrounding whirlpool, so I rented a helicopter, wandered. One Tree is where they went to get their strength back. It's where Buttercup and Westley first made love, where poor Waverley was born. Probably I shouldn't call her poor Waverley. She had a great time for a while. Parents who loved her, the world's greatest fencer as her guard, the world's strongest man as her babysitter. Can't ask for a whole lot more. Of course, everything changed with the kidnapping. But I better shut up now, before I get ahead of the story. Buttercup's Baby, S. Morgenstern's glorious examination of courage matched against the death of the heart. Abridged by William Goldman. 1. Fezzik dies. 1. Fezzik. Fezzik chased the madman up the mountain, the madman who carried the most precious thing for Fezzik ever to be on earth, the kid herself, Buttercup's baby. Chased was perhaps the wrong word. Lumbered after might have been more accurate. However you wanted to put it, the news was not good, because Fezzik, try as he might, was falling farther and farther behind. There were two reasons. The first, size. They were 15,000 feet in the air, the rise was sheer, and Fezzik had terrible trouble finding footholds that might make him secure. His huge, clumpy feet would touch here or there, seeking sanctuary, but it took too much time. And the madman used that time to his advantage. increasing his lead, occasionally glancing down with his skinless face to see how much farther Fezzik had fallen behind. Even to Fezzik, his plan was clear. Get to the crest, run across the plateau, start down the far side, leave Fezzik helpless, still trying for the ascent. The second reason for Fezzik's lack of success was this: fear. Or, to be more specific, fears. Being the biggest and strongest, no one realized he also had feelings. Just because he could uproot trees, people didn't want to know that the little squirmy bugs that lived in the roots spooked him. Just because he had defeated the wrestling champions of 73 countries, people didn't believe that his mother had to keep candles burning all night long when he was, comparatively speaking, little. Of course, the idea of public speaking was beyond thought. But Fezzik would rather have spent the rest of his years in constant speech-making than face what was staring at him now, the possibility of falling, with nothing but rocks to crush his body at the end. True, he had climbed the cliffs of insanity, but that was different. He'd had a rope to hold on to, so he knew which way to go, and he'd had Vizzini insulting him, which always made the time pass more pleasantly. If only the madman possessed some other baggage, Fezzik would have stopped and crept back down to safety. If only it was all the silver in Persia, or a pill that you only took once and you weren't a giant anymore. Easy to stop the chase then. But this was Waverley, his blessing, and though he knew in his great heart he would lose this pursuit, knew he would somehow slip, Fezzik lumbered on. He glanced up. She was rolled in the blanket she had been kidnapped in. And how long ago was that now? Fezzik chose not to remember, because the kidnapping had been his fault. He had allowed it, somehow. It had happened on his watch. Fezzik blinked back quick tears of remorse. Her body was still. The madman probably gave her some potion to make her easier to carry. Above him, the madman stopped, pushed, kicked out, and giant rocks were coming down toward him. Fezzik did his best to get out of their way, but he was too slow. The rocks grazed his feet, knocking them loose from their holds, and now he, Fezzik the Turk, was swinging high in space, holding on by just the strength of a few fingers. The madman cried out with delight, then climbed on, rounded a mountain corner, was gone. Fezzik hung in space, so very afraid. The winds picked at his body. His left hand began to cramp, so Fezzik took it out of the hold, reached a yard up to a better one. He hung there thinking, and what he thought was not how very afraid he was, but that he had just gone up 3 entire feet using only his hands. Could he do that again? He reached up another yard, found another hold. This is all very interesting, he told himself. I actually went up without using my feet. I went up faster than before without using my feet. And then, suddenly, he was moving, just using his hands to reach, grab, then the next, reach, grab, and never mind using all 4s, just use the upper 2s. And then he was moving fast. Fezzik flew up the mountain now. Somewhere on the other side was the madman, probably taking his time, feeling sure that Fezzik was gone. Fezzik increased his speed, up to the crest, then to the plateau, racing across it with enormous strides, and when the madman got there with the babe, Fezzik was waiting. "I would like the child," Fezzik said softly. "Of course you would." The madman had no mouth. The sound came from somewhere inside his skinless face. He still held Waverley's body. Fezzik took a step nearer. "I can breathe fire," the madman said. Fezzik knew that it was true, but he was unafraid. Another step closer. "I can change shape," the madman said, louder now, and Fezzik knew that it was true. But he also knew this. Fear had entered the heart of his enemy. "These are my final words," Fezzik said. "When I tell you to give me the child, you will give me the child." "I will use all my magic on you." "You can try," Fezzik said softly. "But even though you have no face, I can see how frightened you are. You are frightened that I will hurt you." He paused. "And I will." He paused again. "Badly." The fear inside the madman was pulsing now. Fezzik's great hands reached toward the blanket. "Give me the child," he said, and the madman started to do that very thing, but then, instead, he flipped his hands so that Waverly rolled out of her blanket, spun high into the mountain air. The momentum carried her over the edge where the two men were standing, and as she spun, her eyes fluttered open, and she looked around wildly, saw Fezzik, reached out toward him as she fell from sight, said the word she alone called him, "Shade." Fezzik had no choice. He dove into space after her, gave up his life for the child. Well, what do you think? It's exciting. I'll give Morgenstern that. A grabber, as TV guys say. But this is a novel. You have time to develop plot and character. No one's changing the channel here. So, I'm not nuts about it. I also don't like calling Chapter 1, Fezzik Dies. Do you believe that Morgenstern's really going to kill Fezzik? I sure don't. Not for a New York minute. Forget that he's my favorite. But think what he did for Buttercup and Westley. He let himself get set on fire just before the castle storming. He found the 4 white horses they all rode to freedom on. And don't think for a minute Inigo would have made it down through the zoo of death without Fezzik right there with him. So, in a way, he saved Westley. And I'm sorry, you don't knock off someone like that. It's wrong, just to get your story off with a bang. In other words, I disapprove of this opening. There are, in fact, a number of things I'm not happy with in this chapter. But you know the reasons I have to go along. And I'm also not sure I should be including this next section about Inigo. I had a big fight with my publisher, Peter Gethers. He's against putting it in, finds it confusing. Before I give my reasons, I think you better have a chance to see for yourself what we're arguing about. 2. Inigo. Inigo was in despair. Hard to find on the map. This was after maps, not because cartographers didn't know of its existence, but because when they visited to measure its precise dimensions, they became so depressed they began to drink and question everything. Most notably, why would anyone want to be something as stupid as a cartographer? It required constant travel. No one ever knew your name, and, most of all, since wars were always changing boundaries, why bother? There grew up, then, a gentleman's agreement among map-makers of the period to keep the place as secret as possible, lest tourists flock there and die. Should you insist on paying a visit, it's closer to the Baltic states than most places. Everything about despair was depressing. Nothing grew in the ground, and what fell from the skies did not provoke much happy conversation. The entire country was damp and dank, and why the locals all did not flee was not only a good question, it was the only question. Locals talked about nothing else. "Why don't we move?" husbands would say each day to wives, and wives would answer, "God, I don't know, let's." And children would jump and shout, "Hooray, hooray, we're out of here!" But then nothing would happen. Bindibus live in more hideous conditions, but they don't travel a lot either. There was a certain comfort in knowing that no matter how bad things were, they couldn't get worse. "We have endured everything," the locals would tell themselves, whereas, if we pick up and go, say, to Paris, we would get gout and be insulted by Parisians all day. Inigo, however, had a warm spot for the place, for it was here, years and years ago, that he had won his first fencing championship. He had arrived shortly before the tournament was to begin, and he had come with a heavy heart. Tears always behind his eyes. He could not shake his mood because of what had just happened to him in Italy on his first visit there. A journey he had begun with such hopes. By the time he turned 20, Inigo Montoya of Arabella, Spain, had spent his last 8 years wandering the world. He had not yet begun the hunt for the six-fingered man who had killed his beloved father, Domingo. He was not ready, and would not be until the great sword-maker, Westley, pronounced him so. Westley, his father's dearest friend, would never send him out if there were flaws. Flaws would not only bring death, but, far worse, humiliation. Inigo knew one thing, and that only. When he finally found his tormentor, when he was at last able to face him and say, "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die." There could be no question in his mind of defeat. The six-fingered man was a master, and so, preparing for such a master, Inigo had wandered the world, getting stronger as he grew, learning from whoever could teach him mysteries that needed solving. Lately, he had begun to specialize. His talents were past phenomenal, but still not good enough to get the blessing of Westley. He had recently been to Iceland to spend months with Ardnok, the great frozen terrain expert. Inigo had already mastered fighting from below and from above, fighting from trees, from rocks, in rapids. But what if the six-fingered man was from the far north, and they battled on frost or freshly watered ice? And what if Inigo, helpless and slipping, lost his balance, lost the battle, lost everything? After Iceland, he spent half a year on the equator studying with Atumba, the master of heat. Because what if the six-fingered man came from a steaming country, and what if they battled in the heat of the hottest day, temperature at 150? And what if the grip of his sword went wet for a moment in his hand? Now, having just turned 20, he was in Italy to see Piccoli, the tiny ancient, the acknowledged king of the mind. Piccoli was from the most famous line of great Italian teachers. Another branch was centered in Venice and taught singing to every famous Italian tenor whose name ends in a vowel. Inigo knew he would not be able to think when his death battle came. His mind had to be a spring day, and his movements had to come on their own. His spins and twists and thrusts all had to leap unbidden. Piccoli lived in a small stone house, in the employ of Count Cardinale, the strange and secret man who controlled most of the country. Piccoli had heard of Inigo because although Westley was the greatest and most famous maker of swords, there were rumors that when he was confronted with a task that was too much even for him, he would go to the town of Arabella, high in the hills above Toledo, to the hovel of one Domingo Montoya, a widower who lived with a young son. It was there that the six-fingered sword had been forged. Could it truly be the wonder of his world? Piccoli had heard of it for a decade, yearned to see it dance before he died. The greatest weapon since Excalibur, and where was it now? Gone with the child Montoya from the house of Westley, and where was that child? Piccoli had spent his entire long life training his mind, so that he had the ability to sit for a day in the middle of a mad battle and know nothing of the screams and slaughter going on around him. When he was in his mind, he was as if dead, and every morning at dawn he would go into his mind and stay there till noon. No power could disturb him. He had gone into his mind at dawn one day, there to stay till the sun was highest. But on this one morning at 8 o'clock, a strangeness. He was in his mind, as he always was at 6, and at 7, and at 7:30, and at 7:45, and 10 till, and 5, and 4, and 3. And then Piccoli was pierced by something so dazzling, even he had to open his eyes. To see a young man approaching, tall, blade-thin, muscular, spring-legged, who was handsome enough, but would have been more than that, save for the 2 scars that paralleled his cheeks, who held such glory in his hands. The sun was dancing there. Piccoli could not breathe as the young man approached. "I want to see Mr. Piccoli, please. I wish to see your sword." Piccoli trembled as he took it in his tiny hands. "What could you possibly want from me?" He could not take his eyes off the weapon. "You have the world here." Inigo told him. "You want me to teach you to control your mind?" Piccoli asked. Inigo nodded. "I have come from very far." "A waste, I fear. You are young. The young have not the patience. They are stupid. They think their bodies will save them. Let me learn. Pointless. Go wage your battle without me. I beg you." Piccoli sighed. "All right. Let me show you how stupid you are. Answer my queries. What on all the earth do you want more than anything?" "Why, to kill the 6-fingered man, of course." And with that, Piccoli started screaming. "Wrong! Wrong! Listen! See what I say!" His voice grew soft, seductive. "The 6-fingered man has his sword in his hand. He thrusts. See what I say, Montoya. Watch the sword. He has thrust the sword toward your father. Now the sword is entering your father's heart. Domingo's heart is shredded, and you are 10 and standing there. You are helpless. Do you remember that moment? I command you, remember that moment!" Inigo could not stop his sudden tears. "Now you are watching him fall. Look! Look at him! Watch Domingo die!" Inigo began sobbing out of all control. "Tell me what you feel." Inigo was barely able to speak the word. "Pain." "Yes, right, of course, pain. Killing pain. That's what you should want more than anything. An end to your pain." "Yes." "That pain is with you every moment, every day?" "Yes." "If you think of ending your pain, you will kill the 6-fingered man. But if you only think revenge, he will kill you, because he has already taken the thing on earth you treasured most, and he will know that. And when you battle, he will say things, he will taunt you, he will talk about your pathetic father, and he will laugh at your love for failure like Domingo. And you will scream in rage, and your revenge will take control, and you will attack blindly, and then he will cut you to pieces." Inigo saw it all, and it was true. He saw himself charging, and heard himself screaming, and then he felt the 6-fingered man's sword as it entered his body, drove through his heart. "Please, do not let me lose to him," he finally managed to say. Piccoli looked at the shattered young man before him. He gently returned the 6-fingered sword. "Go dry your tears, Montoya," he said at last. "We start your training in the morning." It was savage work. Inigo had never imagined it would be anything less, but Piccoli was merciless beyond human reckoning. For 8 years, Inigo had sprinted 2 hours each day to make his legs muscular and strong. Now, with Piccoli, he could not sprint at all. For 8 years he had squeezed apple-sized rocks 2 hours a day, so his wrists might deliver the death blow from any and all positions. Now, rock squeezing was banned. For 8 years he had never skipped and dodged less than 2 hours a day, so his legs would be quick. Now, no skipping, no dodging. Inigo's body, so lash-strong, so whip-it-quick, the body he had shaped for lethal combat, the body that was the envy of most men. That body? Piccoli hated it. "Your body is your enemy while you are with me," Piccoli explained. "We must weaken it for now. It is the only way you can grow your mind. As long as you think you can fight your way out of trouble, you will never be able to fight your way out of trouble. For 8 years, Inigo had gotten by on 4 hours sleep. Now, that was all he did. Sleep, doze, rest, snooze. He catnapped under orders, siesta'd constantly. It seemed to him he was grabbing 40 winks every time 80 winks had gone by. And while resting, he had to think about his mind. Weeks passed. He was sleeping 12 hours a day at first, then 15. Piccoli's goal was a fat plenty, and Inigo knew the torture would never stop until his goal was reached. He did nothing but lie there and think about his mind. His only job was to think about his mind, get acquainted with it, learn its ways. His sole exercise was 15 minutes each day while the sun went down. Piccoli would send him outside, the sword in hand, and nod, just once, and Inigo would flash in the dying light, the sword alive, and his body would leap and duck, and the shadows moved like ghosts. Piccoli was very old, but once he had seen Bastia, and this was Bastia again, alive again on earth. One more nod from the tiny ancient head, and back to rest, to bed, to lie there and think about his mind. And it went that way until the day Piccoli had to go to the village for provisions. Inigo was alone in the stone house, and then there were soft footsteps approaching, and a soft voice inquiring for the owner, and then Inigo was alone no longer. He looked toward the figure framed in the doorway, stood, and spoke these most remarkable and unexpected words. "I cannot marry you." She looked at him. "Have we met, sire?" "In my dreams." "And we decided not to marry? What strange dreams from such a young fellow." "No younger than you." "You work for Piccoli?" Inigo shook his head. "Mostly I sleep for Piccoli." "Come closer." "I have no choice." "You work in the castle?" "I have lived there all my life. My mother, too." "Inigo Montoya of Spain." "You?" He waited for her name. He knew it would be a wondrous name, a name he would remember forever. "Giulietta, sire." "Do you think me strange, Giulietta?" "I'd be pretty dopey if I didn't," Giulietta said, before adding, "Sire." "Do you feel your heart at this moment?" "I feel mine." "I'd be pretty dopey if I didn't," Giulietta said. Her black eyes studied his face so closely before she said, "I think you better tell me of your dreams." Inigo began. He told of the slaughter and his scars, and how, when he had healed, he had begun his quest, and how, wandering through the world, town to city to village, alone, always that, sometimes he made up companions, since there were none really for company. And, when he was perhaps 13, there was a someone always waiting for him at the end of the day. As he grew up and older, she grew older too, the girl, and she would be there, always there, and they would eat scraps together for dinner, and sleep in haylofts in each other's arms, and her black eyes were so kind when they looked at him, as your eyes are kind now, as you look at me, and her black hair tumbled down, as I can see yours now tumbling down, and you have kept me blessed company all these years, Giulietta, and I love you, and I will forever. But I cannot, and I hope you understand, because my quest comes first, above all else, even with what I see in your eyes. I cannot marry you." She was so obviously touched. Inigo knew that. Inigo saw that he had moved her deeply. He waited for her reply. Finally, Giulietta said, "Do you tell that story often?" I'll bet the village girls go nuts over you." She turned toward the door then. "Go try it on them." And she was gone. The next morning, before he went into his mind, she was back. "Let me get this thing straight, Inigo. We had scraps for dinner? I'm in your fantasy, and the best you can come up with is scraps?" She turned toward the door then. "You have no chance of winning my heart." Inigo went back into his mind. The next noon, she poked him awake. "Let me get this straight, Inigo. We slept in haylofts? You couldn't even come up with a clean room at an inn? Do you know how scratchy haylofts are?" She turned toward the door then. "You have less chance of winning my heart today than you had yesterday." Inigo went back into his mind. The next dusk, she stood in the doorway. It was just before his 15 minutes of movement, and she said, "How do I know you're going to find this six-fingered man? And how do I know you can beat him? What if I took some kind of weird pity on you and waited, and then he won? That is my nightmare. That is why I study." She pointed at his sword. "Are you any good with that thing?" Inigo went outside and danced with the six-fingered sword in the dying light. He tried hard to be particularly dazzling, and ended with a special flourish taught him years before by Macpherson in Scotland. It involved a spin and a sword toss, and ended with a bow. "Impressive stuff, Inigo, I admit it," she said when he was done. "But what happens after you find this guy and run him through? How are you going to earn a living doing stunts like that? What do you expect me to do? Play the tambourine and gather the crowd? You have so little chance of winning my heart. There is no point to our ever seeing each other again. Goodbye." Watching her leave, there was no question. Inigo's heart was aching. She did not return till the night of the ball. Inigo could not help but hear the music pouring out of the castle down through the night. Musicians had been practicing for days. Suddenly, Giulietta was there, beckoning. "It's so beautiful," she whispered. "I thought you might want to see. I can sneak you in, but you must do exactly what I say. It will go badly if we are found out." They raced through the long shadows, paused only briefly outside the kitchen. Then she nodded, and they were inside. And she pointed left to show that was their way, then right, and he followed till the ballroom itself stood before them. It was a sight beyond his conceiving. A room of such size, such elegance, with flowers to fill a forest and musicians playing softly. Inigo stared, and kept staring, until he heard a gasp, and Giulietta whispered, "Oh no, the Count is here. I must go. Get behind the door." Inigo slipped behind the door, wondering how horrible the punishment was for sneaking into a castle, for peering in rooms only the mighty should behold. He closed his eyes and made a silent prayer that the Count would never see him. He opened his eyes to nightmare. The Count was staring at him, an old man, dressed in such magnificence, with a look of such disdain, and a voice of shattering power. "You," he began, his rage already building, "are a thief." "I have never stolen," Inigo started to say. "Who are you?" Inigo could not get the words out. Montoya, Inigo Montoya of Arabella, Spain." "A Spaniard? In my house? I shall have to fumigate." And then the Count came close. "How did you get in here?" "Someone brought me, but I will never reveal her name. Punish me. Do anything you will with me. But her name will always be a secret from you." Then he gasped, as Giulietta stood in a distant doorway. He gestured for her to run, but the Count's turn was too fast, and he saw. Do nothing to her, Inigo cried out. She has lived here all her life, as did her mother before her. Her mother was my wife, the Count roared, loudest of all. You pathetic excuse for a money-grubbing fool! You disgrace to the face of the world! And with a shriek of disgust, he turned and was gone. Giulietta was beside Inigo then, so excited. "Daddy likes you," she said. They danced through the night. They held each other as lovers do. Inigo, with all of his study of movement, swirled like a light-footed dream. And Giulietta had been trained since childhood for such things. And the musicians had played for fat dukes and grotesque merchants, but now, looking at this dark couple hardly touching ground, they realized their music had to match the dancers. Even today, all the servants in the Castle Cardinale remember the sound of that music. Of course, before the spinning and the holding, there were a few minor points that needed a bit of ironing out. "Daddy likes you," Giulietta said, watching as her father stormed away. "Time out," Inigo said. "If you're his daughter, that makes you a countess, and if you are a countess, that makes you a liar, because you said you were a servant. And if you're a liar, I cannot trust you, because there is no excuse for lying, especially when you knew of my dreams and my love. And so, I must say, farewell." He started to go. "One thing," this from Giulietta. "More lies?" "You judge. Yes, I am a countess. Yes, I lied. It is not all that easy being me. I do not expect sympathy, but you must hear my side. I am one of the richest women on earth. In the eyes of many men, one of the more attractive. I am also, please believe me, and I know it sounds arrogant, but I am also wise and tender and kind. I did not dress as a servant girl to fool you. I always dress as a servant girl, to try and find truth. Every eligible noble for 1,000 miles has come to the castle to ask my father for my hand. They say they want my happiness, but they only want my money, and all I want is love." Inigo said nothing. She took a step, so she was closer. Then another, so she was beside him. Then she whispered quickly, "When you came here with your dream, you won my heart. But I had to wait, to think, and now I have thought." She gestured for the musicians to play even more beautifully. "This is our party. We are the only guests. I did all this to please you, and if you do not kiss my mouth, Inigo Montoya of Spain, I will more than likely die." How could he not obey her? They danced through the night. Oh, how they danced! Inigo and Giulietta, and they embraced, and he kissed her mouth and her tumbling hair. And Inigo felt for the first time since the dying such happiness. It had fled from him, happiness, and when you spend years without, you forget that no blessing compares. Guess what? It stops there. Bang, the little riff on happiness, end of section. I call this the unexplained Inigo fragment, and what Peter objected to, as well as the fact that he finds it confusing, is simply this: nothing happens. He's right, in a strictly narrative way, but I feel that here, for the first time, Morgenstern shows us the human side of Inigo, so we know he's more than just this Spanish revenge machine. Frankly, I wish I'd known this part existed before I read The Princess Bride. I don't think I could have cared any more deeply than I did, but my God, what poor Inigo gave up to honor his father. Think about it. We all have fantasies, right? You think before I met and married her, I cared about this vision of Helen, my genius shrink wife? Of course not. But here, Inigo has made this perfect creature for his own heart, and he finds her, and she loves him back. And they part. That's an assumption of mine, I know. But since we are told Inigo had a heavy heart when he reached despair, and he came there from Italy, I have to go that way. I included this section here for a very simple reason. I think it's Morgenstern at his best. I ran it by King, of course, and he felt I had to include it, since Morgenstern did. He also put me in touch with this professor cousin he has at Florida University, the son of the lady who runs the great restaurant. And this cousin, a Morgenstern expert, feels that the confusion on my part is my fault. That if I'd done sufficient scholarly preparation, I would understand Morgenstern's symbolism, and would therefore know that plenty happens here. Namely, according to this cousin anyway, it is here that Inigo first learns that Humperdinck has set a plan in motion to kidnap Westley and Buttercup's first child, right after it's born. And then Inigo has to race back to One Tree and stop that from happening. King's cousin says this unexplained Inigo fragment isn't a fragment at all, but a complete part of the whole of the novel. I don't get any of that. If you do, great. And while you're at it, decide if you think I was right or not, including it. If you disagree, that's okay. All I know is my heart was pure. 3. Buttercup and Westley. The 4 great horses seemed almost to fly toward Florin Channel. "It appears to me as if we're doomed, then," Buttercup said. Westley looked at her. "Doomed, madam? To be together till one of us dies." "I've done that already, and I haven't the slightest intention of ever doing it again," Westley said. Buttercup looked at him. "Don't we sort of have to sometime?" "Not if we promise to outlive each other, and I make that promise now." Buttercup looked at him. "Oh, my Westley, so do I." From behind them suddenly, closer than they had imagined, they could hear the roar of Humperdinck. "Stop them! Cut them off!" They were admittedly startled, but there was no reason for worry. They were on the fastest horses in the kingdom, and the lead was already theirs. However, this was before Inigo's wound reopened, and Westley relapsed again, and Fezzik took the wrong turn, and Buttercup's horse threw a shoe, and the night behind them was filled with the crescendoing sound of pursuit. You see what he's done here? This half-page above is, of course, the ending of The Princess Bride, and this will only take a sec, but I'd like to draw attention to what he's doing in the sequel. Playing with time. Look, I snitched in my explanation that Waverley was going to get kidnapped. Forget that. Morgenstern tells you the same in the very opening pages, with Fezzik on the mountain. Okay, so the kidnapping's already happened. Then, in the unexplained Inigo fragment, he tells us that the kidnapping's about to happen. At least according to King's cousin, he does. Now, here, he goes back to before Buttercup and Westley have even safely gotten away from Humperdinck. I think it's interesting, but some of you may find it confusing. Willie, my grandchild, did. I was reading it out loud to him, and how great a feeling was that, sports fans, when he said, "Wait a sec." So I did, and he said, "How can Inigo hear about the kidnapping, and the next sentence practically, it's Princess Bride all over again?" I explained it was the way Morgenstern chose to tell this particular story. Then he said this, "Can you do that?" I sure hope so. However, this was before Inigo's wound reopened. Me again, and no, that was not a typo. I just thought it would make the transition easier if I repeated the last paragraph. Go right on now. And Westley relapsed again, and Fezzik took the wrong turn, and Buttercup's horse threw a shoe, and the night behind them was filled with the crescendoing sound of pursuit. Fezzik's mistake came first. He was in the lead, a position he tried to avoid whenever possible, but here he had no choice, since Inigo was losing strength with each stride, and the lovers, well, they just sopped back and forth to each other about eternity. Which meant Fezzik, the ideal friend, the loyal follower, the lover of rhymes, Perhaps not the most brilliant of fellows, but certainly the most devoted bringer-up of any rears you might mention, found himself facing the most hateful, the most insidious bewilderment ever conceived of by the mind of man. A fork in the road. "It's not actually a road, Toad," he reassured himself. "It's more a path, wrath. Nothing to cause fret, sweat." They were on their way to Florin Channel, where the great pirate ship Revenge was waiting to scoop them up and head them all toward happiness. So relax, Fezzik, he told himself. Treat the escapade as a lark. Hark. A memory that would in the future bring warm smiles. After all, it was not even remotely a large fork. It was, if you will, petite, sweet. A mere jog in the lane. Pain. Fezzik almost made himself believe that. Then reality took hold. Because it was still a fork, something that required thought, wisdom, a plan. And he knew he could screw up something like that any time. Me here, and no, this is not an interruption, just a note to explain I have gone to a lot of extra work to make this perfect, as you know, and I didn't want anyone writing in to point out that screw-up was anachronistic. It isn't. It's an ancient Turkish wrestling expression, a shorter version of corkscrew up, a hold that brings pain of such magnitude that death soon follows. To corkscrew down, of course, has been illegal for centuries. Everywhere. The fork came closer. They were surrounded by trees everywhere, always thickening, and the brutes behind were clearly gaining. And even though the fork was indeed wee, it had to be there for a reason, and that reason, Fezzik believed, was that one way led to the channel, and the waiting Revenge, while the other led elsewhere. And since the sea was their only profitable destination, elsewhere, no matter where else it elsed, was the same as doom. Fezzik turned quickly to ask Inigo his opinion, but Inigo was bleeding so terribly now, the bouncing of the stallion not being helpful when you have recently been slit inside. Fezzik instinctively reached back, grabbed his weakening comrade, pulled him onto his horse to see what he might do to save him. And while he was reaching, the fork was on them, and Fezzik wasn't even watching as the horse took the left turning, which turned out to be, alas, toward elsewhere. "Hi," Fezzik said, once he had Inigo in front of him. "Are you excited? I'm as excited as can be." Inigo was too weak for reply. Fezzik studied Inigo's wound, pushed one of Inigo's hands deeper into it, hoping to somehow help stop the bleeding. It was clearly up to him to save Inigo now, and to do that he'd have to get him to a good blood clogger. Surely the Revenge would employ such a fellow. From Inigo this. A groan. "I agree completely," Fezzik said, wondering how the trees could become so much thicker so very quickly. It was amazing. They were almost like a wall now in front of him. "I'm also sure that just past this last wall of trees is Florin Channel, and all our dreams will come true." From Inigo, the same, only less of it. Then his fingers managed to clutch Fezzik's great hand. "I go to face my father now, but Rugen is dead, so it was not a useless life. Beloved friend, tell me I did not fail." He was losing Inigo now, and as he held the wounded fencer in his arms, Fezzik knew few things, but one of them was this. Wherever the bottom of the pit was located, surely he was there now. "Mr. Giant?" he heard then. Fezzik wondered who Buttercup was talking to, until he realized that they had never actually been introduced. Oh, he had rendered her unconscious, kidnapped her, almost killed her, so you couldn't say they were unacquainted, but none of it was truly a formal how do you do. "Fezzik, princess." "Mr. Fezzik?" She cried out louder than necessary, but it was because at that moment her horse threw a shoe. "Just Fezzik is fine. "I'll know you mean me," he told her, watching her face in the moonlight. Never had he seen an equal. No one had. Except at the moment she was not at her best. Since not only was her horse behaving erratically, there was such pain behind her eyes. "What is wrong, Highness? Tell me so that I might help." "My Westley has stopped breathing." Wrong as usual, Fezzik realized. The pit is bottomless. He instinctively reached back, grabbed his breathless leader, pulled him onto his horse to see what he might do to save him. And while he was doing the reaching, his overburdened horse stopped. Had to, for there was now a wall of trees, blocking any progress. And Inigo would not stop bleeding, and Westley would not start breathing, and Buttercup would not stop staring at him, her face lit with the hope that of all the creatures left stomping the earth, he, Fezzik, was the only one that could save her beloved, and thereby stop her heart from shredding. Fezzik, at this heroic moment, knew what he wanted most to do: suck his thumb forever. But since that was out of the question, he did the next best thing. He made a poem. "Fezzik's in trouble, bubble, bubble. His brain is just not in the pink. His mind is rubble, rub-a-dub-double, because everyone needs him to think." Great work, no question, considering he was carrying 2 almost corpses on his stopped horse, while the princess was weeping, hoping for a miracle. Fezzik went for a different rhyme scheme, hopeful it would jog something useful. "Great-armed Fezzik, blocked by trees, forget that she is crying. Though lost, and that it's all your fault, forget that 2 are dying. Mighty Fezzik, strong of brawn, who most around think brainless. All you have to do is spawn a plan that will be painless. Fezzik the fearless, Fezzik the wise, Fezzik the wonder of the age, Fezzik who—" The who is lost to time now, because it was at that moment of poetic inspiration that Prince Humperdinck's razor-sharp, metal-tipped arrow ripped through Fezzik's clothing on its way to his great heart. Once he realized they had taken the left turning, Prince Humperdinck knew they were his. He turned to Yellen, the chief enforcer of Florin, a finger to his lips. Yellen raised a hand, and the 50 trailing members of the brute squad slowed. The moon's perfect yellow dusted the thickening trees. Humperdinck could not help but stare at their beauty. Only the trees of Florin could interrupt, however briefly, a blood hunt. Was there any place on earth with such trees? Humperdinck wondered. No. Resoundingly no. They ranked among the treasures of the universe. During the prince's contemplative moment, Yellen gestured for the brute squad to get into their attack groups, the knifers here, the stranglers there, the crushers in between. The prince rounded the last small turning, and there in front of him, so beautifully framed by the perfect trees, was the death tableau. His weeping runaway bride, the 2 still men on the buckling horse, held there in the arms of the giant. "Damn," he told himself. "If only I'd brought the royal sketcher." Well, he would just have to hold this in memory. In the prince's world, the world of scourge and pain, there was still great controversy who to initially attack. Should the nearest be selected, or should it be the leader? Clearly Westley was that, but at the moment a frail one at best. And the other still man must have had power, since he had killed Rugen. Not the easiest task. It was standard to leave the women for last. They were not expert at blood. They also whimpered and looked to the heavens for escape. Always good for chuckles around future campfires. Leaving the giant. The prince unsheathed his bow, selected his sharpest metal tip, made the insertion. He was a great archer, but at night, with moonlight and shadow, he was a good deal more. He had not missed a night kill in ever so long. An inhale for balance, a final smile to the trees. Then the pullback, the release, and the arrow was on its straight way. The prince held his breath until he saw the arrow rip the cloth of the giant at the heart site. The giant cried out loud in shock and fell backward off his horse. As he fell, Yellen led the brute charge, and the battle of the trees, brief though it was on. The 50 brutes at full cry, charging the 3 men lying sprawled on the ground, the lone woman trying to somehow hold them all in her arms. As her attackers came eyeball close, Buttercup had this thought. If she had to die, what better way existed than with her true love in her arms and the beauty of her beloved Florinese trees covering her with their branches? Even as a child, nothing pleased her more than the glorious trees at the bottom of her farm, and when her chores for the day were done, that is where she went to wander so happily. What peace they gave! And they would continue to give that peace to her fellow Florinese forever, and— Time out. Can you believe that last paragraph? Buttercup's about to die, and she thinks of foliage? Horrible. Horrible. So, do not hold your breath waiting for the stupid battle of the trees. I went nuts when I first read this. I'm like you, probably, zooming happily along, and Morgenstern was clearly a master of narrative, but right now, I bet you are wondering this. What happened? My God, Fezzik shot in the heart, the 2 other guys drifting away, Buttercup trying to hold it all together, while these 50 armed brutes come charging in. We all want to know what happened, right? Here is what you are not reading. 65 pages on Florinese trees, their history, and importance. Morgenstern had already started, if you noticed. Just when he realizes he's got them, Prince Humperdinck does an entire dumb paragraph about trees, even as Florinese publishers begged him to cut it. So I don't care what grief those Morgenstern whizzes at Columbia give me, if ever anything needed getting rid of, it was this. Want to know why he put it in? It actually has to do with The Princess Bride, or rather, its success in Florin. Morgenstern was suddenly flush, so he went right out and bought this country house that was off by itself and abutted this huge government-owned forest preserve. He was, indeed, master of all he surveyed. However, he had been misinformed. This lumber company had title, and not long after he moved in, guess what? They began sawing down all these trees. Morgenstern went nuts. He really did. His entire correspondence with the lumber company is right there in the Morgenstern Museum, just to the left off Florin Square. He couldn't make them stop, and in a year or 2 his house was all naked and alone, and kind of dumb-looking. So he sold it, at a loss, which just killed him, and moved back into town. But from then on, he became the country's best-known tree savior. He had his eye on another country place, turns out, similarly secluded, and he wouldn't buy it until he felt he was safe from the lumber interests. So what he did here in Buttercup's Baby was carefully build this huge suspense moment, confident that his readers would have to read his tree essay in order to find out who lived and died. Briefly now, in terms of narrative, this is what you found out. A. Fezzik survived Humperdinck's metal-tipped arrow because of Miracle Max's Holocaust cloak, which Fezzik kept tucked inside his tunic, and the folds of it blunted the arrow's impact, saving his life. B. The pirates from the ship Revenge were hiding in the trees, so when the brutes were about to slaughter our quartet, they rained down on them like a rage from heaven and took care of them all in just a couple of minutes, and when Humperdinck and Yellen saw this, they both fled. Then, C. The pirates, headed by Pierre, their #1 guy and next in line to become the dread pirate Roberts, took the 4 and scooted out to the Revenge with them, hoping everyone would be alive when they all got there. Time. back in. As soon as the four were safely aboard, Pierre signaled for the anchor raising, and the great pirate ship Revenge slipped through the waters of Florin Channel toward open sea. A snap of his fingers brought the blood clogger, who set to work on Inigo, while Pierre himself, chief medico and second in command, turned his attention to Westley, or, as he was known on the ship, the dread pirate Roberts. Fezzik and Buttercup stood close by. Buttercup could not stop trembling, so she reached out, tried to hold Fezzik's hand, realized the size discrepancy, held his thumb instead. The clogger ripped off Inigo's shirt, examined the bleeding man. There were minor sword wounds near each shoulder, but they were nothing. The stomach drew his attention. "A three-sided Florinese dagger," he said to Pierre, then turned to Fezzik. "When?" "A few hours ago," Fezzik answered, "while we were storming the castle." "I can clog him," the clogger said, "but you will have little use for this." He indicated the six-fingered sword still clutched in Inigo's right hand. "Not for a very long time." And with that, he scurried off, returned in a moment with flour and tomato puree, mixed them expertly, began filling the wound. He looked at Pierre, then nodded in the direction of Westley. "Want me to work on him?" "This is not a matter of blood. Listen." He pounded on Westley's chest, listened to the awful, empty sound. "His life has been sucked away." "It happened this afternoon," Fezzik said, carefully, trying not to upset Buttercup any more. "If you were in town, you probably heard his death scream." "That was him?" Pierre cried out. "They did that to my master? Where was this?" "At the bottom of the Zoo of Death." Fezzik indicated Inigo. "We found him there." Pierre studied Westley a moment longer before he sagged. "He must have been tortured beyond human endurance." He shook his head. "If only I'd been with you, I would have known what to do. I would have rushed him to Miracle Max." Fezzik started bouncing up and down. "But that's what we did. We went straight there for a resurrection pill." Energy began to flow back into Pierre's body. "If Max worked on him, then we have hope." "We have more than hope," Buttercup said. "There is true love." "Princess," Pierre said, "you work your side of the street, and I'll work mine." He looked at Fezzik, thinking. Then this question. "Did Max tell you how dead he was?" "Sort of. But then he slipped to mostly." Pierre nodded. "Mostly is not ideal, but I can work around that." "Was it a new resurrection pill, not an old one Max had hanging around?" "Made fresh today. I had to gather the Holocaust mud," Fezzik said. Pierre was getting excited now. His eyes blazed at Fezzik. "Last and most important question. Did Valerie have time to do the chocolate coating?" "She let me lick the pot," Fezzik said, happy because he knew he was giving the right answer. "It was delicious." Little cut here. I already said in the introduction that they went to One Tree Island to get their health back, so there's not a lot of nail-biting tension in the air concerning Westley's survival at this point. What you're not going to read is a 6-page sequence in which Pierre, and we all care desperately about spending time with him, right, does all these wondrous modern Florinese medical things to help Westley. None of which work, Natch, because at this point in his life Morgenstern had a hate-on for doctors, because he had developed gas. And I'm sorry if this is disgusting to you, but I promised King I would research the hell out of it, and I did a lot of legwork before I found that Morgenstern's entire medical record is on view in the museum. But not everyone can see the personal stuff like this. You have to have some kind of scholarly interest to read it, and even then, you can't take it out of the place. I forget where this sentence began, sorry, but anyway, he had gas. couldn't shake it, and gave Pierre the sequence to get his own back. When nothing worked, by the way, Fezzik picked Westley up and hung him by the feet over the side till his lungs filled with seawater, a famous cure in Turkey. Not for death, but rather gout, which Fezzik's father suffered from. Westley coughed like crazy, but it got him talking again. Inigo was still unconscious, but had stopped bleeding when Westley finally opened his eyes. Middle of the night. Buttercup lay alongside him on the deck, while Fezzik watched over them all. Pierre approached, knelt, spoke softly. "I have the worst of all news." "Worst does not exist," Westley whispered. He studied Buttercup's face. "We are together." Pierre took a breath, then said it. "You must leave the ship, and you must do so this night." Before Buttercup could voice her outrage, Westley put a finger to her lips. "Of course, I understand. Humperdinck is after us." "His entire armada. We can outrun them for a while, but sooner or later, as long as you are here." "We are not in the best of shape for travel," Buttercup said. "Give us a few days. My husband is the most powerful man for 1,000 miles. No place on earth is safe from him." "Not possible. Much as I would like to. The crew would panic, as well they should, and I cannot have them losing faith in me." Westley nodded. Then he was silent. Then he said Fezzik's name. Fezzik waited. "Do you remember the climb up the cliffs of insanity?" "I don't want to go back there," Fezzik said. "I'm afraid of heights." "Fezzik," Westley said patiently, "I don't want to live there either. Just answer me this. You were carrying 3 people when you did it, and please think before you answer me. Were you tired?" Fezzik waited till he was sure he had it right. Then he said, "No." "Why weren't you? Our lives depend on this, so please take your time." Fezzik didn't need time. "My arms," he said quietly. Westley looked at him only a moment more. Then he turned to Pierre. "We will need chains and a small boat." He paused. "Go quickly now. You must get us close to One Tree Island by dawn." The Revenge made spectacular time, full sail and a favoring wind, and soon they were sailing through a remote part of Florin Sea. Before dawn, the small boat was lowered, and the 4, all heavily chained to Fezzik now, got in. Neither Westley nor Inigo were capable of much movement. Fezzik took the oars, Westley nodded, and Fezzik began to row. From the bridge, Pierre said, "I pray to see you again." "Do," Westley told him. Buttercup cradled him in her lap. "That was so sweet of him," she said. "He did not seem a man of great religious conviction." "This will be his first prayer, and it could not be for a more needy group." "Why do you say that?" Buttercup asked. "Let us just hold each other," Westley said, "while we can." "That's fairly ominous of you, don't you think?" Fezzik listened, terrified. But he had so many questions, he did not know where to begin, so he just rowed. And every so often he smiled down at Inigo, who every so often was able to smile back. They were silent then, the 4, for what seemed a very long time. The night could not have been prettier, the weather balmy, the waves all but non-existent, a sweet, caressing wind. Ah! Fezzik rowed on, getting into a fine rhythm, his great arms enjoying the outing. He rowed harder for a moment, and, of course, the tiny boat went faster. Then, back to normal pace, and, of course, the tiny boat slowed. Fezzik enjoyed doing that. It got rid of the monotony. Harder, faster. Normal, slower. Harder, faster. Normal, faster. Fezzik thought. I wonder why that happened. He rowed harder again, and this time the vessel seemed close to flight, and it was then that Fezzik pulled the oars entirely out of the water, and the boat careened on faster than before. Much faster than before. And then, in the distance, but approaching quickly, came the roar. And Fezzik said, "Oh, Westley, I did something wrong. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to zoom like this. I was just sort of breaking the monotony, faster, slower, that kind of thing, and I never meant for this to happen." "It is not you," Westley replied, keeping his voice as steady as he could, so as not to make things worse for his comrades. "The whirlpool has us now." Inigo blinked awake on the word. "Fezzik, row around it." "We can't do that," Westley said then. Buttercup spoke all their thoughts then. "Westley, my hero and savior, what's the deal here?" "I'll be very brief. Humperdinck's armada is after us. We need to disappear and mend. One Tree Island, from all I've heard, may well be the best spot on Earth for us." "And just what makes it so special?" Buttercup asked, louder now, because the small boat was rocketing now and the roar was growing loud. "I can't be specific because I've never been there," Westley explained, half shouting, holding tight to the side so as not to be pulled overboard. "No one has ever been there. It is shrouded by mist, with just the top of the single tree visible above the clouds. The mist is caused by the whirlpool. The island is surrounded by the whirlpool and rocks. No boat can sail through. The rocks crush it, or the water sucks it down. Now do you see why it is perfect for us? Humperdinck cannot get there, and soon he will lose interest in trying to." "Let me get this straight," Buttercup said. "The entire armada cannot get to the island, but we can? That is my belief. I don't mean to be pushy about this, but I am not keen on being crushed or drowned. Westley, what in the world do we have that they don't?" "We have Fezzik," Westley replied simply. "We absolutely do," Fezzik shouted, happy that the answer was so easily forthcoming. "He is right here inside my skin." "But, my darling, what can Fezzik do?" "Why, swim us through the whirlpool, of course." No one answered for a moment, because at that moment the tiny boat began to crack from the pressure of the water, and the roar of the whirlpool began to surround them, which meant it was very close. Westley checked Buttercup's chains and Inigo's, as well as his own, making certain they were securely locked around Fezzik. The boat had little left it could do. It had brought them close, but now, ahead, the rocks became visible, and Westley shouted through it all, "Save us, Fezzik! Save us or we die!" Now, Fezzik, as the world knows, had a terrible case of low self-esteem, so he was all for the theory behind Westley's words. Saving people. How wonderful. What in all the world could be better than saving people, especially these three with him now? Nothing. So in theory, he should have made ready to dive in. In practice, he just sat in the bottom of the boat and shivered. "Fezzik! Now!" Westley shouted. Fezzik shivered all the worse. "He needs a rhyme," Inigo explained to Westley, then to Fezzik. "Fezzik is no zero." Fezzik shivered even more. "Do you want a hint?" Inigo shrieked as the boat began to splinter. Still the shivering. "He's a hero," Inigo went on. Fezzik would have none of it, put his head in his hands. "What could he be afraid of?" Buttercup cried out. "Fezzik!" Westley shouted into Fezzik's ear. "Are you afraid of the sharks?" Even worse shivering, and a shake of the head. Now the whirlpool was starting to spin them. "Is it the sucking squid?" Still worse, and another shake of the head. Now the whirlpool began to pull them down. "Is it the sea monsters?" More shivering, more shaking. And Westley, aware that they had next to no chance of survival the way things were going, cried, "Tell me!" Fezzik buried his head in his hands. And then, from Westley, the loudest shout of all. "Nothing is worse than sea monsters. What are you so afraid of?" Fezzik raised his great head and managed to look at them. "Getting water up my nose," he whispered. "I hate it so much." And then he buried his head again. The boat was shattering by this time. In the final moments, they clung to the remnants, and Westley said, "I am too weak for the task. Inigo, you do it." And Inigo said, "I am a Spaniard. I do not hold another man's nose." And Buttercup, not for the last time, heard herself say, "You men." And then, as the whirlpool had them in its power, she took both of her hands and clamped them over Fezzik's nose. The whirlpool knew from the first it had them. It had not lost a battle in centuries, not since a soldier coming home from the Crusades caught it at a remarkably calm time, managed to slip almost past, was but a few feet from one tree's shore before, exhausted, he collapsed backward, and the whirlpool made no mistakes this time. Just kept him down at the bottom longer than it had ever kept anyone, before releasing its grip, letting him float up toward where the sharks waited. The sharks were waiting this day, too, excited, four to shred, and they swam just at the outskirts of the whirlpool, watching as the bodies sank. Fezzik made no resistance whatsoever, did nothing till he was certain Buttercup's grip was solid. The whirlpool took them under, sped them down, on their way to the bottom, and Fezzik let it happen, hoping only that the others could hold their breaths longer than they ever had. And soon he could feel the bottom of the sea. It was not deep here. Whirlpools did not love deep water, and Fezzik bunched his giant body and shoved down with his mighty legs, shoved harder than he ever had before. As soon as his body began its upward trajectory, he started with his arms, his great, tireless arms, windmilling them with more ferocity than the whirlpool had ever known. And it did what it could. Increased its roar, swirled more savagely. But the arms would not stop. Nothing could make them stop. And the chains held, and the others were unconscious from the battle. But Fezzik knew, as soon as he surfaced at the far end of the whirlpool, that Inigo had been right with his rhyme. He was definitely not a zero. Not this day of days. They were still chained when they reached the shore of one tree, and they stayed that way for 2 days, all of them motionless, near dead from wounds and torture and exhaustion. Then they unchained themselves and, staying close together, began to explore their new home. Me, obviously, and I'm sorry, but you don't want to read 10 pages on vegetation. Morgenstern's tree fixation scores again. His point here is that one tree, being pretty close to Eden, is what all of Florin could be if only people didn't chop everything down. The 4 get their strength back slowly. Buttercup nurses them, and Fezzik takes care of food, cooking and cleaning the fish that was most of their diet. Buttercup one day has nothing special going on, so she makes him a gift for his nose. A clothespin. Well, Fezzik goes nuts, he's so happy. It fits perfectly. He's never without it, etc., etc. And, armed with that, Fezzik becomes the scourge of the area, swimming all over, fighting sharks and sucking squids. Tastes like chicken. I thought the more squeamish among you would be glad for that bit of info, bringing his catch of the day back for food. Anyway, this section ends with the moon high, perfect night, very romantic, all that. Inigo and Fezzik are off in their tents, dozing, Buttercup and Westley sitting alone by a flickering fire. "You know, we've only kissed," Buttercup said, staring at the embers. "Of course," Westley replied. Not getting the answer she expected, Buttercup tried again. "We've certainly had more than our share of adventures. No one can deny it. And true love, to have that, we must be the most blessed of creatures." "Surely the most blessed," Westley agreed. "But," Buttercup said then, trying for frivolity, "thus far, the unalloyed fact that shines out is this: we have only kissed." "What else is there?" Westley asked. He touched his lips lightly to her cheek, sighed. "Surely there could be nothing more." This was somewhat disingenuous on his part, because he had been king of the sea for several years, and, well, things happened. "Silly lad," she told him, smiling. "I have enough knowledge for us both." Of course I should, considering all those classes in love-making I took at royalty school. She had taken the classes, but since Humperdinck had instructed her professors to teach her nothing whatsoever, Buttercup, though she smiled, was terrified. "I'm anxious for your teachings to begin." She looked at his perfect face. She thought that, more than anything, she wanted this to go as it had in her heart. But what if she failed? What if she was just another case of big talk, little do, and eventually he would tire of her, leave her? "I know so much, it is hard to be sure just where is the best place to begin. If I go too fast, raise your hand." He waited, and when he saw the helplessness in her eyes, he realized he had never loved her quite so much or so deeply. "Will you try not to laugh at me?" "I would never embarrass a beginner such as yourself. It would be cruelty itself to mock your ignorance when I, of course, am totally wise." "Do we begin standing up or lying down?" "A very good question, that," Buttercup said quickly, not having the least notion what else to say. "There is great controversy as to which." "Well, perhaps it would be wise to cover both contingencies. Why don't I get a blanket in case lying down carries the day?" The blanket he brought and spread for them was soft, the pillow softer still. "If we were to lie down," Westley said, lying down, "would we start close together on the blanket or far apart?" "Again, great controversy," she replied. "You see, one of the problems with knowing so much is one sees both sides of questions." "You are very patient with me, and I appreciate that." He held out a hand for her. "We could do this. We could try lying close together on the blanket and experiment, more or less." Buttercup took his strong hand. "My professors were all in favor of experimenting." They were very close on the blanket now. The breeze, seeing this, knowing what they had been through to reach this moment, thought it might be nice to caress them. The stars, seeing this, thought it might be nice if they dimmed for a while. The moon went along with the whole notion, slipping half behind a cloud. Buttercup still held his hand. She wondered for a moment if it would be wise to stop now, tell truths, try again another evening. She was about to suggest that, but then she looked deeply into his eyes. They were the color of the sea before a storm, and what she read in them gave her the strength to continue. "Want a shocker?" Willie liked that scene. I remember when my father read The Princess Bride to me, I hated the kissing stuff. I told him before I read it he might find it a little short on daring do, so maybe that helped. His only question after was what kind of things happened when Westley was king of the sea. I answered that if Morgenstern had wanted us to know, he would have told us. He bought it. Phew! Anyway, you will probably not be surprised to learn the obligatory 9 months flew by pretty fast, and "I think sunset would be a lovely time," Buttercup said. "I think he would like that, opening his eyes to the world at that moment. Yes, sunset it shall be." She was speaking at breakfast to the others, and they all agreed. In point of fact, since none of them had the least experience with birthing, they could hardly argue. And no one could argue with Buttercup's handling of herself. She had blossomed in the 9 months since she and Westley first made love, had dealt with her situation with a serenity remarkable in one so young. True, the first months brought a touch of morning sickness, and yes, it was discomforting. But all she had to do to banish it was look at Westley and tell herself she was bringing another such as he into the universe, and poof, the sickness was in retreat. She knew their firstborn would be a boy. She had a dream the first month that it would be so. The dream recurred 2 more times, and after that she never doubted. And she behaved throughout as if this were the most normal of human conditions. You swelled, certainly, but that didn't stop you from your regular life. which in her case often consisted of helping Fezzik cook, helping Inigo mend his heart, walking and talking with Westley, discussing their future, where they would settle, what they might do with the rest of their lives, considering that the most powerful man on earth was out to kill them. After the meal, she was ready. Westley had made her a special birthing bed, the softest straw and pillows softer still. It faced west, and he built a nearby fire, and he had kettles boiling with pure water. An hour before sunset, when her contractions were but 5 minutes apart, he carried her to the bed and set her gently down, and sat alongside her, massaging her. She was so happy, as was he, and by the time the sun was starting to set, the contractions were but 2 minutes apart. Buttercup stared at the sun and smiled, took his hand and whispered to him, "It's what I always wanted most on earth, bringing your son into life at such a time, with you beside me." They were both so happy, and Westley told her, "We are one heartbeat," and she kissed him softly and said, "And will always be." During this, Inigo was fencing with shadows, excellent practice if you had no proper opponent to play with. Westley, of course, was superb, and they had spent many happy hours slashing away at each other. But now, as sunset ended, Inigo made ready to stop soon and go welcome the baby. Fezzik usually watched them, or Inigo alone, when that was the case, but not this night. He was hiding on the far side of one tree, the sky-topper, and he was holding his stomach and trying not to groan and be a bother, but the truth was this: for the strongest man on earth, for a man who earned his living inflicting pain, Fezzik was squeamish. He could handle blood as well as the next fighter when it came from an opponent. But he had asked Westley and Inigo what was it going to be like when Buttercup's son was born, and though neither of them were expert, they both indicated there might be some blood, as well as other stuff. Fezzik rolled on the ground as the phrase "other stuff" went through his bean. There was a Turkish word that described such things. Byok. Fezzik held his stomach and thought Byok over and over. He knew from looking at the stars overhead that the boy was shortly to arrive. But by midnight they knew something was wrong. The contractions were but a minute apart as they looked out at the sun's afterglow, but that is where they stayed. At 10, they were still as before, and Buttercup would have handled it quietly as she had the preceding hours. But at midnight her back began to spasm. She could withstand that. Westley was beside her. What were spasms? She was settling in for a long visit with them, until the pain crept from her back to her hips, found one leg, then both, set them on fire. The blaze in her legs was the beginning of her torment. Her color faded, but she was still Buttercup, and she was lit by the glow from the flames. She was still, then, something to see. It was not till dawn that they saw what the pain had done to her. Westley stayed alongside, rubbed her back, massaged her legs, toweled her perspiring face. He was wonderful. By noon, they knew something was very much wrong. Fezzik rumbled over, took a look, ran back, and hid in his spot, helpless. Inigo grabbed the 6-fingered sword and fought with the breezes until he realized the sun was going down again, and they were into the second day. "I don't want you to worry," Buttercup whispered to her beloved. "Nothing unusual so far," Westley replied. "From all I've heard, 30 hours is perfectly normal." "Good. I'm glad to know that." When the next dawn came and she had clearly begun to weaken, she managed to say, "What else have you heard?" And Westley said, "Everyone agrees on this. The longer the labor, the healthier the baby. How lucky we shall be to have a healthy son." By the second sunset, it was only about survival. Fezzik sobbed behind the tree as Westley counseled with Inigo. They spoke evenly, but terror was starting to circle about them. "I don't know of such things," Inigo said. "Nor do I. I've heard of a cutting that can save the life. You cut the woman somehow. And kill my beloved? I would kill whoever tried. Just then Buttercup cried out, and Westley ran to her, dropped beside her. I'm sorry to be such a bother. What caused the scream? Buttercup reached for his hand, held it so tight. My spine is on fire. Westley smiled. How lucky we are. Once that happens with the spine, well, that's a clear signal that our son is about to be born. The spine is nothing, not when you get used to it. I have had real pain. When I heard Roberts had killed you, that was hard to deal with. I suffered then. But this— She tried to snap her fingers, but her body was not obeying her. Nothing. Inigo and I were just talking about where to go once we are a family. You remember how before I left your father's farm I was thinking of America? That still seems a good notion to me. What do you think? She whispered. America? Yes, across the ocean somewhere. And do you know when I first loved you? Tell me. Well, we were young, and you had just berated me terribly, called me a dullard and a fool as you did in those days. Farm boy, why can't you ever do anything right? Farm boy, you're hopeless, hopeless and dull, and you'll never amount to anything. Buttercup managed to smile. I was horrible. On your good days you were horrible, but you could be much worse than that. And when the boys started coming around, you were at your worst. One evening, when they had all gone away and I was in the barn brushing horse, and you came out humming and silly and said, I can have any boy in the village and la-di-da, and I went to my hovel and I said to myself, that's it. You can keep those idiots for all I care. I am gone. So I packed my belongings and I started out of the farm, and I looked up at your window and I thought, you will be so sorry for humiliating me because I will come back here some day with all the wealth of Asia. Goodbye forever. You really left me? That was the theory, but the reality was this. I turned and took a step toward the gate and I thought, what value has all the wealth of Asia without her smile? And then I took another step and thought, but what if that smile comes and you not here to see it? I just stood by at your window, and I realized I had to be there in case your smile happened. Because I was so helpless when it came to you, I was so besotted by your splendor, I was so ecstatic to be near you, even though all you did was insult me. I could never leave. She smiled, the sweetest smile she could manage. Westley gestured for Inigo to come closer. I think we've rounded the corner, he whispered. I can see that, Inigo whispered back. But they were living on hope, and they both knew they were, and Westley held her so gently as her breathing grew increasingly weak. Inigo patted Westley on the shoulder, as one comrade does to another, nodded that all was going to be well, and Westley nodded back. But Inigo in his heart knew this. It was soon to be over. And behind the tree, Fezzik alone gasped, because he knew this. He was suddenly not alone any more. He began to try and fight it, because something was invading him, invading his brain, and the Lord only knew his brain could use a little help. But Fezzik struggled on, because when you were invaded, you never knew who was coming along for the ride, a helper or a damager, someone good or more terrifying, someone who wished anguish. Fezzik's mother had been invaded the day she met his father, for she was far too shy to approach him and flirt the way Turkish lasses were supposed to do in those days. So she just stood aside while the other village girls swooped him up. And she wanted Fezzik's father, wanted to spend her life with him. She knew that, but she was helpless, so she scuffed away, leaving the field to the braver girls. But then the invasion came, and suddenly Fezzik's mother was brassy, and her temporary new tenant gave her confidence to do wonderful things. So back she went to join the other village flirts, and she outdid them all, with her flaunting smile and the wondrous way her body moved. At least it did that day, and Fezzik's father was smitten with her, and even though the invader left that evening, they got married, and his mother was so happy, and his father only wondered as the years went on, wondered whatever happened to that glorious, brazen creature who had won his heart. Fezzik could feel his power going as the invader took control. His last thought was really a prayer, that please, whoever you are, if you harm the child, kill me first. And by the fire Westley held Buttercup all the more tightly and said words of optimism, and Inigo always replied in the same tone. Until that awful 50th hour of Buttercup's labor, when Inigo could lie no more, and said the dreaded words, "We've lost her." Westley looked at her still face, and it was true, and he had done nothing to save her. Not once in all of his life, except when he was in the machine, had he ever let tears visit. Not even when his beloved parents were tortured in front of him, not once, never, never, the one time. Now he fauceted. He fell across her, and Inigo could only watch helplessly, and Westley wondered what was he going to do until he died, because going on alone was not possible. They had battled the fire swamp and survived. If he had known how it was going to end, Westley thought at that moment he would have let them die there. At least, that way they would have been together. And then, from behind them, there came a sound more strange than any they had come across before, a disembodied sound, as if a corpse were talking, and the sound boomed out at them. "We have the body." Inigo whirled, then cried out in the night, and Westley, in despair, was so surprised at Inigo's sound, he whirled, and he too cried out in the night. Something was moving toward them out of the darkness. They both squinted to make sure. Their eyes did not deceive. Fezzik was moving toward them out of the darkness. At least, something that looked like Fezzik was coming toward them. But his eyes were bright, and his pace was quick, and his voice— they had neither ever heard a voice like it, so deep, thunderous, and measured. And the accent was something they had also never heard before, not until they finally reached America, or, more accurately, when the ones left alive got there. "Fezzik," Inigo said, "this is not the time." "We have the body," Fezzik said again. "We have a fine, strapping child inside. She has been kept waiting far too long." Now the giant knelt beside the still woman, gestured for Westley to move, put his ear to her, clapped his hands sharply. "You," he said, pointing at Inigo, "bring me soap and water to disinfect my hands." "Where did he hear that word?" Westley asked. "I don't know, but I think I'd better do it," Inigo said, hurrying to the fire. And now Fezzik pointed to the great sword. "Sterilize it in the fire." "Why?" Inigo said, bringing Fezzik the soap and towel. "To make the cut." "No," Westley said. "I will not let him give you the sword." And now the voice took on a power more frightening than ever. "This child is a putterer. That is what we call those that linger too long. But this child is more than that. She is in backward, and the umbilical cord is tightening around her throat. Now, if you wish to live your life alone, keep the sword. If you wish a child and wife, do what I tell you." "Be at your best," Westley said, and he nodded for Inigo to hand the great sword to the giant. Fezzik marched it to the fire, sizzled the point red, returned to the lady, knelt. "The umbilical cord is very tight now. There is little breath left now. There is little time." And for a moment Fezzik closed his eyes, breathed deep. Then he moved. And his great hands were so soft, the giant fingers so skilled, and as Westley and Inigo stared, Fezzik's hands did his bidding, and the sword touched Buttercup's skin. And then there was the cut, long but precise, and then there was blood, but Fezzik's eyes only blazed more deeply, and his fingers waltzed, and he reached inside and gently took her out, took the child out, a girl. Buttercup was wrong, it was a girl. And here at last she came, pink and white, like a candy stick. Here came Waverley. 4. Fezzik falling. She was considerably below him at the start, twisting and spinning from momentum and wind. Fezzik had never seen the world like this, from this high 15,000 feet, with nothing below to break the fall, nothing, but at the far end, rock formations. He called after her, but, of course, she could not hear. He stared after her, but, of course, he was not gaining. There are scientific laws explaining that bodies fall at the same speed no matter how different the size. But the makers of the laws had never tried explaining Fezzik, because his feet, so useless at finding holds on sheer mountainsides, were unmatched at flutter-kicking in falling air. He cupped his fingers so his hands were perfect hollow mitts, and then he set to work, swinging his arms and fluttering his feet, so that if you tried to watch them, you couldn't, and then Fezzik strained still more. And the distance between them began to close. From 100 feet to half, then half again, and when he was that close, Fezzik called out to her, his word, "Keed." She heard and stared up, and when he had her eyes, Fezzik made her favorite silly face, the one where his tongue touched the tip of his nose, and she saw it, of course, and then, of course, she laughed out loud with joy. Because now she knew what all this was, just another of their glorious games that always ended so happily. From the start, they were different. Sometimes, when she was very little and dozing and Fezzik was helping Buttercup, he would say, "She has to tinkle," and Buttercup would answer, "No, she doesn't, she's just—" And then she would stop before she got to "fine," because Waverley had blinked awake soaking wet, and Buttercup would look at Fezzik in those moments with such a look of wonder. Or sometimes Waverley and Buttercup would be playing happily, Fezzik watching, always there, watching so close, and Buttercup would say, "Fezzik, why do you look so sad?" And Fezzik would say, "I hate it when she's sick." And that night a fever would come. He knew when she was hungry or tired. He knew why she was smiling, and when crankiness was just around the corner. Which made him, in Buttercup's mind, the perfect babysitter, since how could you improve on a sitter who knew what was going to happen? So Fezzik looked after her constantly, and when she dozed, he would sit between Waverley and the sun, which was why, when she started to talk, she called him Shade, because he was that, her shade in those earliest days. Later, when she learned games, she had but to blink in his direction, and he knew, not that she wanted to play, but which game. Westley agreed with Buttercup that although, yes, theirs was an unusual nurse-child relationship, it was a blessing, since it provided her with time to heal and recover, and better yet, time for them to be together. So Fezzik and Waverley learned from each other and enjoyed each other. Occasional spats, of course, but that comes, as Buttercup explained to him one day, with mothering. "Can Waverley come play in the whirlpool with me?" Fezzik would ask constantly. Buttercup would hesitate. "It gets her overtired, Fezzik. Please, please, please." Buttercup would give in, of course, and off they would go, stopping first for the clothespin, then into the water. Waverley sitting securely on his head, his hands gripping her feet, and whoosh! It was truly magical watching them, as Inigo and her parents did often, because Fezzik, having conquered the whirlpool, had befriended it. He would kick up to speed, then swim into the whirl and let it carry them around, with Waverley shrieking and Fezzik keeping balance as they rode the water together, their favourite game, which always ended so happily. Fezzik was close enough to reach out now, so he did, brought the child into his arms, made another face, took her fears away. "Shade," she said, so happy. 3,000 feet now. Next, he pulled her close to him, 2,000. He knew as the rocks flew up toward him that he could never save himself. But if he could bundle her next to his body, if he could lie flat in the air and bring her into his arms so his mighty back took the initial assault, there was a good chance she would be shaken, yes, shaken terribly. But she might live. He made his body flat against the wind. He pulled her to him with all his sweet strength. "Kid," he whispered finally, "if you ever need shade, think of me." One final silly face. One blessed responding laugh. Fezzik closed his eyes then, thinking only this: thank God I was a giant after all. Willie was quiet when I finished. He gathered up his baseball and his frisbee, hit the elevator button. Dinner time coming up, and I had to get him home. He didn't speak again till we were on the street. "No way Fezzik dies. I don't care what the chapter's called." I nodded. We walked in silence, and you know how Fezzik could tell what was going on with Waverley? Well, I can do that with Willie, at least on my good days, and I knew this great question was coming. "Grandpa," he said finally, "do you think I love that? You remember how much money Westley was going to get when he decided to leave Buttercup after she tormented him once too often about the boys in the village? That's how much." "Speak into the microphone," I said, making my hand one. "Okay, that thing that invaded Fezzik, here's what I don't get. How did it know to invade him right then? I mean, if it came a day earlier, it would have just had to wait around inside him for 24 hours feeling stupid." I told him I doubted that question had ever been asked on planet Earth before. Jason and Peggy were waiting at the door. "It was good, Dad," Willie said. "It played around with time a lot." "We really need another novelist in the family," Jason said, and I laughed and hugged everybody, started back home. It was a gorgeous spring evening, so I let the park win me for a while, just walked in silence, thinking. First thing that has to be said, Morgenstern hasn't lost a whole lot off his fastball. This is clearly a different piece of work from The Princess Bride, but he was a much older man when he wrote it. And since maybe this is the end of my involvement, a couple of closing thoughts. Like Willie, I don't believe Fezzik is going to die here. My money is on Morgenstern saving him. He saved him from Humperdinck's arrow with the Holocaust cloak. He'll come up with something. The unexplained Inigo fragment. What was that? Couldn't he have given us a couple of hints, at least, as to why? Will it all make sense later? Who was the madman on the mountain? Was he born without skin? How did he get Waverley? Was he the kidnapper or just a member of a gang? And if he was just a member, who was his boss? And who did invade Fezzik? A beautiful young couple passed me then. She was pregnant out to here, and I wished her a Waverley. And I realized something, and this is it. We've traveled a long way, you and I, from when Buttercup was only among the 20 most beautiful women on earth, because of her potential, riding horse and taunting the farm boy, and Inigo and Fezzik were brought in to kill her. You've written letters, kept in touch. You'll never know how much I appreciate that. I was on the beach at Malibu once, years back, and I saw this young guy with his arm around his girl, and they were both wearing T-shirts that said, "Westley never dies." Loved that. And you know what? I like these four, Buttercup and Westley, Fezzik and Inigo. They've all suffered, been punished. No silver spoons for this bunch. And I can just feel these terrible forces gathering against them. I just know it's going to get worse for them than it's ever been. Will they all even live? Death of the heart, the subtitle says. Whose death? And even more important, maybe, whose heart? Morgenstern has never given them an easy shot at happiness. This time, I sure hope he lets them get there. Florin City, New York City, April 16th, 1998. The Princess Bride, A Reader's Guide, by William Goldman. Special Reader's Guide interview with the Princess Bride characters by Paul Whitcover. 1. The Remora. In considering the relationship between the freelance writer and a great publishing house, it may be helpful to think of the lowly remora. This cute little fish survives by glomming onto a shark and sucking its blood. Sharks are not the most discriminating of diners, but remoras aren't too finicky either. They can't afford to be. And so it is with freelancers like myself. Yet occasionally an assignment comes along that feeds the soul as well as the body, and although no freelancer will publicly admit it, we don't even like to admit we have souls, much less worry about feeding them. The truth of the matter is that there exists for every freelancer a job that he or she will do, well, for free. This is mine. Let me explain. I've been a fan of The Princess Bride since I was a teenager. I own a copy of the movie and watch it 2 or 3 times a year. I read the book at least once a year. I foist it upon friends and girlfriends. In college, I once broke up with a girl over the question of whether or not Westley was really in love with Buttercup, or just the idea of Buttercup. You might think then that I know a lot about The Princess Bride. I certainly thought so. I was wrong. Just how wrong wasn't clear until the Monday I got a call from Ballantine Books asking if I'd be interested in conducting an interview for the 30th anniversary edition of The Princess Bride. Would I? Dear reader, I would have paid for the privilege. Heck, I would have killed for it. I told Ballantine I would check my schedule and get back to them. Freelancer rule number 1, always play hard to get. The first question I asked when I called back 5 minutes later, freelancer rule number 2, but not too hard, was, when will I be interviewing Mr. Gold? I didn't actually say Mr. Gold. That was just as far as I got before the beautiful Denise cut in. Denise works in editorial. Even though I live in New York City, I've never actually met her, but I figure that anyone with such a beautiful voice has got to be beautiful all over. Oh, said the beautiful Denise, you won't be interviewing him. We want you to interview the characters about true love. I see, I said, although I didn't. We need it by Friday, she added beautifully. Bye, Remora. Okay, she didn't actually say Remora. I just felt like a sucker. The beautiful Denise, oh, she was beautiful all right. Beautiful like a shark. 2. The Professor. Interview the characters. It was a tough job, no question. But did I panic? Did I despair? Are you kidding? We freelance writers enjoy a good challenge. I spent the next 4 days researching The Princess Bride. Then I panicked. My deadline was less than 24 hours away, and I was no closer to my goal than when I'd started. Oh, I know what you're thinking. Why not make something up? But I refused to consider it. How could I? The Princess Bride is based on a famous episode in Florini's history, and it's wrong to take liberties with history. Goldman didn't do it, Morgenstern didn't do it, and by God, I wasn't going to do it either. So, what did I do? I did what any self-respecting freelancer would do under the circumstances. Made a beeline for the nearest bar. I sat down, ordered a shot of cheap whiskey, and toasted my reflection in the fly-spotted mirror. To Denise, who wrecked my freelance career beautifully. After the coughing had subsided, I ordered another, and again prepared to toast my reflection. To the beautiful Denise, who— I trailed off. Sitting beside me, studying me intently, was a white-haired old geezer sipping a glass of wine. "She broke your heart, this Denise," he said in a surprisingly gentle voice. "In the manner of speaking," I said, "although I've never met her. Actually, I've only heard her voice over the phone. But it's a remarkably beautiful voice." "I understand," he said. Strangely enough, I believed him. "Who are you, anyway?" He handed me a card. It read, K. Bongiorno, Ph.D., MMA, Chairman, Department of Florinese Literature, Columbia University. I looked up from the card into a kindly, weathered face framed by a wild mane of white hair. Not Professor Bongiorno, the preeminent authority on Morgenstern? He inclined his leonine head with grave modesty, as if to say that he did not claim such a distinction for himself, but would not dream of insulting me by disputing it. "But this is fantastic!" I exclaimed. "You're the one man who can help me." "I shall be glad to try, but in matters of the heart, I am only so-so." "This isn't about Denise," I told him. "It's not about love at all. It's about the Princess Bride." "Young man," he said sternly, "the Princess Bride is about nothing if not love." "What about adventure?" "Love, true love, is the biggest adventure of all. Now, tell me your troubles." So I did. The professor listened without interrupting. When I finished, he raised his snowy eyebrows. "A piece of cake." He dipped his fingers into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a pair of battered bifocals, which he set down on the stained surface of the bar. "Go ahead," he said. "Pick up the sodding bifocals." "I beg your pardon?" SOD, suspension of disbelief. Haven't you ever heard literary critics telling each other to sod off? Well, this is what they're talking about. I picked up the glasses. They looked like they were already antiques when Ben Franklin invented bifocals. "Look through the top half of the lenses, and whatever you're reading is perfectly normal," Bongiorno explained. "But peek through the bottom half, and the action becomes suspended, frozen, and you, the reader, enter the story. You can talk to the characters, though only one at a time. When you're done, the story will resume, and the characters will forget they ever saw you." Seeing my skepticism, the professor continued, "It will be just as real as the two of us talking at this bar, I assure you." "But if this were true, it would have to be some kind of miracle." He rolled his eyes. "Of course it's a miracle. Look on the card. What do you think MMA stands for? Medieval Marching Association? Merry Men Amalgamated? No. It's Master of Miraculous Arts." I gasped. "You're a miracle man, like Miracle Max." "Max was the greatest ever. I'm nothing compared to him." Bongiorno lifted his wine-glass. "To true love and high adventure." I raised my shot-glass and drank the toast. After the coughing had subsided, I noticed that the professor was gone, and the bartender was glaring at me. "Sod off," he growled. And that's exactly what I did. 3. The Turk. Rushing back to my East Village apartment, I threw myself onto my futon, slipped the bifocals on, picked up my copy of The Princess Bride, and began reading. As always, the story swept me away. It wasn't until Chapter 5, when I had to scratch my nose, that I remembered the bifocals. Without thinking, I glanced down. Big mistake. I was in mid-air. A zillion miles below me was a sparkling blue bay and a boat the size of a toothpick. I screamed and grabbed onto the nearest object, a redwood tree that happened to be growing perpendicular to a sheer cliff face. "Who are you?" asked the tree. The tree, of course, was Fezzik, who was climbing a rope up the all-too-aptly named Cliffs of Insanity. Vizzini, Inigo and the kidnapped Buttercup were hanging like Christmas ornaments from his huge torso. Glancing down again, I saw the man in black. He was close, only about 1,000,000 miles away. Who knew that high adventure was so, well, high? "Who are you?" repeated Fezzik. I introduced myself and explained about the sodding bifocals. "What should I do, Vizzini?" Fezzik asked anxiously. "Inigo, what should I do?" But neither the Sicilian nor the Spaniard replied. Like everything and everyone else, they were frozen. I was impressed. Buongiorno knew his stuff. I couldn't get over how big Fezzik was. "I can't get over how big you are," I said. "You make Andre the Giant look like Danny DeVito." "I do not know this giant Andre. He plays you in the movie." "What is a movie?" I'd forgotten that this was before movies. I decided to get on with the interview. "So, Fezzik," I said as calmly as I could while holding on for dear life, "what is true love?" He shifted nervously. "Can you give me a hint? I'm scared I'll get it wrong. Vizzini hates when I get things wrong." "There's no right or wrong," I said. "I just want your opinion." "When Vizzini wants my opinion, he tells me what it is." "I'm not Vizzini. Come on, Fezzik. You must love something." He thought. "I love having friends." "Vizzini isn't your friend," I protested. "He's evil and mean." "You rescued me from Greenland, which, by the way, is not green." "He's going to take that big knife of his and kill Princess Buttercup." "Maybe he won't really cut her up." "He will, and you know it. Doesn't loyalty have limits?" "Not to dimwits." "You're not a—" My ear finally caught on. Fezzik was doing what he always did when he felt lonely or scared. Rhyming. "Hey, let me try. I'm good at rhymes, but bad at climbs." Professor Buongiorno, it turned out, had neglected to mention one detail. When I sodded off into the story, all the characters were frozen, except the one I was talking to. Taking one massive hand from the rope, Fezzik flicked me off his shoulders like you or I might flick a bug. The interview was over, and so it seemed was I. 4. The Sicilian. But instead of smashing onto the rocks, I found myself back on my futon. Man, I thought, these sodding bifocals are better than wireless internet. I wondered if they worked on other forms of reading material. The Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue beckoned from the coffee table. But then I remembered freelancer rule number 6, never miss a deadline. If I blew this, there would be no more Simons from Ballantyne, and no more phone calls from the beautiful Denise either. I paged further ahead in Chapter 5 and glanced down. "Welcome," said Vizzini, leaping to his feet. "You don't seem surprised to see me," I said, taking a step back. He was holding a knife, a very long, very sharp knife. I had interrupted the picnic of death. The 2 wine goblets sat filled with wine and the deadly poison iocane. The man in black sat frozen before one of them. Buttercup, also frozen, lay bound and gagged to one side. The Sicilian made a mocking bow. "Very little surprises a man of my intellect. You, for example, are from the future. You've traveled back in time by means of an advanced technology in order to meet the greatest criminal genius of the age. Me." I was flabbergasted. "How could you possibly—" "A chain of logical deductions quite beyond your ability to grasp, I'm afraid. No offense. None taken." He sidled nearer. "It's plain that you chose to appear in this particular place and time because of my impending victory over the man in black. It further goes without saying that you know which of the goblets holds the iocane. I considered forcing that information from you, but then I realized it wasn't necessary. Since you've come from the future to witness my triumph in the ultimate battle of wits, it follows that my choice of goblet is bound to be the correct one." "Why?" he cackled. Because, from your perspective, I've already made it. The future is fixed. To change it would be inconceivable. Amazing, I said. Still, I wonder if I could kill the man in black while he's frozen. An interesting experiment, don't you think? I hadn't considered the possibility. Could Vizzini change the plot of The Princess Bride by stabbing poor Westley now? I wished that Professor Bongiorno had been a little more forthcoming with his instructions. At least he could have provided a sodding manual. Vizzini, meanwhile, gave an evil laugh and stepped quickly to my side. Don't worry. I won't kill him. I want to see the look on his face when he realizes I've outsmarted him. You, on the other hand— I felt the prick of his knife against my ribs. Me? I squeaked. I am, as you know, a thief. What could be more valuable to a thief than a time-travel device? But it's not a time-travel device. Don't insult my intelligence, he sneered. Any last words? Well, I did want to ask about true love. He cackled delightedly. It doesn't exist, or if it does, it's a sickness that robs men of reason and turns them into fools. The heart, my temporary temporal friend, is the weakest organ, as you are about to discover. And before I could say a word, I learned what it felt like to be stabbed through the heart by a very long, very sharp knife. Not surprisingly, it hurt. A lot. 5. The Spaniard. But not for long. Once again, I found myself back on my futon. I dropped the book and grabbed my side, but there was no blood, no wound. I was glad to be alive and unharmed, but otherwise I wasn't having a lot of sodding luck. I wondered who to interview next. Prince Humperdinck? Count Rugen, the six-fingered man? The former, a sadist and murderer, the latter, an even worse sadist and murderer. The one with his fearsome zoo of death, the other with his pain-inflicting machine. The hell with them both, I decided suddenly. They were evil men like Vizzini. They, too, would try to kill me. And, for all I knew, they might succeed. I picked up The Princess Bride, skipped ahead to Chapter 8, and glanced down. Hello, my name is Inigo— Oof! I went down hard. My arms and legs all tangled up with the arms and legs of Inigo Montoya. The swordsman was the first to recover. He sprang to his feet, adopting the Pfitzer defense. Then, seeing I was helpless and unarmed, he extended his hand to me, the one not gripping that exquisite sword, the greatest since Excalibur, and pulled me up. Sorry about that, I said, adjusting the sodding bifocals on my face. The fault was mine, said Inigo. He would have been strikingly handsome, if not for the twin scars disfiguring his face, one down each cheek. Yet those scars didn't make him ugly either, because you could tell just from his expression that they were badges of honor. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a man to kill. That man, the six-fingered man, stood across the room, his back to a billiard table. He was, of course, frozen. That man is frozen, Inigo observed. I explained about the bifocals. Are you by any chance a friend of Miracle Max? Asked Inigo. Never mind about that, I said. Count Rugen stood like a statue, one hand thrust out as if gesturing Inigo to a halt, the other concealed behind his back. I knew, as the Spaniard did not, what was in that hidden hand. Another piece of treachery from the man who had murdered Inigo's father and then contemptuously scarred him all those years ago. It was too much. Instead of asking about true love, I blurted out, "He's got a dagger." What? As soon as I go back to my apartment, and you forget all this, he's going to throw that dagger, and you— Stop! Shouted Inigo, his eyes flashing passionately. Not one word more. I understand that you mean well, my friend. You would spare me some calamity, perhaps even save my life. If I listened to you, I could disarm the Count, or kill him now, and thus avoid my fate. And all it would cost me is my honor. Did he show any honor when he killed your father? When he marked your face? Why show him any now? Not for his sake, Inigo said. I feel only hate for Count Rugen, but hate is nothing. It wasn't hate that led me to become the greatest, or perhaps the second greatest, swordsman in the world. It wasn't hate that kept me searching for my father's killer all these years. It wasn't even hate that made me join Vizzini. He placed a hand over his heart. You see, I loved my father, and I will honor his memory now by fighting as he would have wanted me to fight. He gave me the saddest and also the bravest smile I have ever seen. No, my friend, for what you have tried to do I thank you, but the son of Domingo Montoya will meet his fate like a man. I will avenge my father with his sword and my own hard-won skill. If they are not enough, well, God never promised us that life was fair, did he? Not that I'm aware of, I said softly, and took off the sodding bifocals. 6. The Man in Black. Back in my futon, I knew it was time to talk to the man who had out-wrestled Fezzik, out-thought Vizzini, and out-fenced Inigo, but where to meet him? The choice was obvious, though it filled me with dread. I paged back to Chapter 6 and glanced down. The machine, like a shark, was a beautiful thing supremely fashioned for a single deadly purpose. Attached to it by a number of soft-rimmed cups of various sizes that clung to his skin like the mouths of 100 remoras, was the Man in Black. Of course, he wasn't in black anymore. He wasn't in anything at all. Except pain. He was in a heck of a lot of that. And the machine hadn't even been turned on yet. At least not today, but every cell in Westley's body was still screaming silently from the last time. That much was obvious, just from looking at him. "I don't suppose you've come to rescue me," he said when he saw me. There was only the barest hint of discomfort in his voice. "I'm afraid not," I said. "I didn't think so," he sighed. "Who are you, and why is everyone else frozen?" Everyone else was Count Rugen and Prince Humperdinck. The latter was frozen in the act of reaching for the pain dial of the machine, but his furious expression left no doubt that he was going to crank it up as high as it could go the second he was unfrozen. "You know what's funny?" asked Westley, after I'd explained about the bifocals. "No, what?" I didn't see anything particularly funny. In fact, I was feeling kind of sick to my stomach. "Humperdinck is about to crank this obscene device up as high as it can go. I know it. You know it. The albino frozen back there in the shadows knows it. And you don't need the mind of a Vizzini to figure out what the result of that is likely to be." At this point he actually chuckled, and I began to understand that it wasn't only the name Dread Pirate Roberts that had commanded the loyalty of his pirate crew. "After all," he said, "I didn't do so hot even when the machine was at its lowest setting." "And that's funny?" I asked, wondering if the torture had driven him insane. "No, not that. This. Just before you arrived, Humperdinck told me that Buttercup still loves me. He said it to torture me, to add to my pain in the seconds before he kills me. As if love, true love, can ever be a cause of pain. As if I could be so selfish as to mourn my own death rather than rejoice that my Buttercup lives. If he had said nothing, or had told me that they were married, or that she no longer loved me, or never had, then, even if I didn't believe him, it would have hurt. Then he would have succeeded in adding to my pain. But now? Now, whatever the pain, it won't be enough to extinguish my love. And though I die and he lives, his pain, his loss, will be worse, I think. That's what I find funny." "But you'll still be dead," I pointed out. I haven't come this far to let death stop me. I was astonished. "Do you think you can defeat death like you did Fezzik or Inigo?" "I'm not crazy. I know I can't beat death, but love can. It does it all the time. Don't you know that?" He looked at me then, and I felt his eyes pierce me as only the eyes of a man about to die can. "Why, you've never been in love, have you?" There was no use lying. "I don't know. Believe me, you'd know. I'm kind of between relationships." "I wouldn't," said Westley, giving me a pitying look, "change places with you for the world." 7. The Princess Bride. It was nearly morning. I was exhausted, and I still had one more interview to go. I had a feeling it was going to be the toughest of all. I flipped to the end of the book and glanced down. I stood in the front rank of Humperdinck's brute squad. Dead ahead, frozen in the act of galloping out of the castle gate on 4 snow-white horses, were Inigo, Fezzik, Westley, and the loveliest woman I've ever laid eyes on. How lovely? Trust me, Shakespeare would have broken his quill in despair, and in case you haven't noticed, I'm no Shakespeare. But here's something you can try at home. Type the words beautiful, sexy, perfection, goddess, and schwing into your internet search engine. Now hit the return key. See the picture that pops up? Buttercup beats it cold. I would have stood there, hypnotized forever, if she hadn't spoken. "Who are you? And why is everyone frozen?" Her voice was as incomparably beautiful as the rest of her. "What's the matter with you?" she demanded. "Can't you talk?" It's just that you're more beautiful than I imagined," I croaked. "More beautiful even than Robin Wright." "Who's Robin Wright?" "She plays you in the—" "Right. Before movies, remember? What I mean is, great beauty can be intimidating." "Ha! It didn't intimidate Humperdinck." I gathered my wits and gave her the sodding explanation. "I don't understand a word of it," she said with a toss of her golden hair. "Are you sure you haven't come to kidnap me again, like that horrid Vizzini? He didn't find my beauty too intimidating either." "I've come to interview you." She groaned beautifully. "Worse than a kidnapper, a reporter. Well, make it fast. Westley and I have a lot of happily ever aftering to get to." "What is it with you and Westley, anyway?" I asked. "I mean, for someone who claims to love you so much, he's sure got a strange way of showing it." "There's nothing strange about it," she exclaimed indignantly, and proceeded to tick off on the fingers of one hand. "He saved me from Vizzini. He saved me from the snow sand. He saved me from the ROUSs. And just now, he saved me from Humperdinck. I admit he did all those things, but he questioned your love for him repeatedly while doing them. He let you go on believing that he was dead. He insulted and belittled you at every turn. And he wasn't just verbally abusive, he was physically abusive too. He struck you. I know this is before feminism and everything, but you've got to admit, he hasn't exactly been Prince Charming." "Well, that's the thing about love," she said. "It's not always pretty. It's not always polite and noble and selfless. Sometimes it's ugly and jealous and resentful. Sometimes it's scary and hurtful. Nobody's perfect, you know. I'm certainly not, despite all this great beauty that I never asked for, and which has all kinds of unpredictable and by no means always pleasant effects on the men I meet, and a lot of the women, too. But I'm not finished," Buttercup interrupted imperiously. She'd obviously been paying attention in princess school. "I don't love Westley because he loves me. There are times I've wanted more than anything not to love him. But you see, it was never my choice. Love is like that. At least, true love is. And when you come right down to it, what's the point of any other kind?" "What's true love?" She didn't even hesitate. "True love is when you not only love the other person for who they are, with all their flaws and imperfections, and all their virtues too, but for who they can be at their absolute best, and you're willing to do everything, even die, to help them reach that absolute best. True love means taking the biggest risk of all, opening your heart to a fellow human being, a creature as fallible as you know yourself to be, knowing that there are no promises in life, no guarantees, and that the future will bring great sorrows as well as great joys." "Wow," I said. But how do you know it's really true love? You know, she said. Something tells you. With me, it was the way I felt when Countess Rugen looked at Westley. Maybe for you, it will be the way you feel when a certain someone looks at you in a certain way. Or something in the sound of her voice. It could be anything. That's not important. What matters is what you do when it happens. Do you accept it and act on it, or do you ignore it or try to deny it? Because true love isn't always convenient. Almost never, in fact. It comes at a bad time, or with the wrong person. That's when you've got to find the courage to follow your heart, no matter what. Because the alternative is death. Living death, which is the worst kind. I know because after I thought Westley had died, I tried to murder my own heart, and I very nearly succeeded. She paused. Why, you're crying. Just something in my eye, I said, and took off the sodding bifocals. 8. The Beautiful Denise. It was early morning. I got off the futon and typed up what you're reading now. Normally I email my assignments to Denise, but not this time. All I could think about was her voice, not Buttercup's, Denise's. How beautiful it was, and how I'd always known somehow that I loved her but had always found reasons not to take the risk. She was younger than me, and lived in Brooklyn, far from my Lower East Side haunts. Most of all, there was freelancer rule number 11. Never date the source of reliable work. But you know what? Buttercup was right. And Westley. And Buongiorno, that sly old fox. So, I'm on my way to the offices of Ballantine Books to drop the interview off in person. When I get there, I'm going to ask Denise out for coffee, and tell her how I feel. Wish me luck. Better yet, wish me adventure. The biggest adventure of all. True love. Reading group questions and topics for discussion. The Princess Bride. 1. William Goldman states that he is adapting The Princess Bride from a novel written by the great Florinese writer S. Morgenstern. Do you believe that there really is such a person? Why or why not? And why do you think Goldman might want to confuse readers about this point? Is that confusion necessary for the kind of story he is trying to tell? 2. Goldman, in his parenthetical asides to readers, refers to Morgenstern as a satirist, and the unabridged version of The Princess Bride as a satire. Webster's Dictionary defines satire as a usually topical literary composition holding up human or individual vices, folly, abuses, or shortcomings to censure by means of ridicule, derision, burlesque, irony, or other method, sometimes with an intent to bring about improvement. Going by this definition, is the Good Parts version of The Princess Bride a satire? If you think it is, explain why, and what is being satirized? If not, what kind of book is it? 3. The Princess Bride is also considered to be a fantasy. The paperback version, published by Del Rey Books, is actually marketed that way. Just look at the spine. The most famous fantasy novel of the 20th century is J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. In what ways does The Princess Bride resemble Lord of the Rings? In what ways is it different? 4. Goldman wrote the screenplay for the film version of The Princess Bride. There are many differences between the two. Identify as many as you can. Why do you think Goldman made these changes? With which of his choices do you agree? Disagree? 5. Why do you think that Goldman inserts himself as a character in his own novel? What other books have you read where the author adopts this narrative strategy? 6. Does Goldman present himself as a sympathetic character? Think about how he describes his relationships with his wife, son, and father. How do these relationships illustrate the fictional Goldman's virtues and faults? And do you think Goldman is portraying his actual wife, son, and father, Or are they also fictionalized characters? 7. The Princess Bride can be thought of as two intertwining tales, one focusing on Westley and Buttercup, the other on the life of Goldman himself, or the fictional Goldman, at any rate. How do these two stories parallel and play off of each other? 8. Should writers draw a firm line between fact and fiction? If a writer puts himself into his story, does he have a moral obligation to be truthful about himself, or is he free to treat himself, and any other real-life person similarly inserted, as a fictional character? 9. When we first meet Inigo and Fezzik, they're working with Fezzik to kidnap Buttercup. Later, they become allies of Westley in his efforts to rescue her. What causes Inigo and Fezzik to change? Or do they really change at all over the course of the novel? 10. Is Goldman's portrayal of Buttercup misogynistic? Is there a pattern in the way that women are portrayed in The Princess Bride? From the starlet, Sandy Sterling, to Goldman's psychoanalyst wife, Helen, to the lawyer Karloff Shogg, who appears in the Buttercup's Baby addendum. 11. Compare the relationships between men, such as Goldman and his father, Fezzik and Inigo, Inigo and Domingo, and Goldman and his son, and those between men and women, especially Westley and Buttercup. Which are presented more positively? Why do you think that is? 12. Is Westley's initial anger at Buttercup for agreeing to marry Humperdinck fair? Based on his actions and words, including at one point striking her, might Westley be considered an abuser? Are his demonstrated attitudes toward women reinforced or undermined by the text, both in his own story and in Goldman's comments? 13. Count Rugen is certainly a sadist, as is Prince Humperdinck. Other characters display submissive or even masochistic behaviors, as, for example, early on when Westley repeatedly replies, "As you wish," to Buttercup's petty commands. How do these strains of sadism and masochism color the portrayal of true love in The Princess Bride? 14. In the introduction, Goldman writes, "But take the title words, True Love and High Adventure. I believed that once. I thought my life was going to follow that path, prayed that it would. Obviously it didn't, but I don't think there's high adventure left anymore." Later he adds, "And true love you can forget about too." Does the rest of the book offer support for these words, or does it refute them? 15. In another parenthetical aside from Goldman, he quotes the mother of one of his childhood friends, Edith Neisser, the author of terrific books on how we screw up our children, as telling him, "Life isn't fair, Bill. We tell our children that it is, but it's a terrible thing to do. It's not only a lie, it's a cruel lie. Life is not fair, and it never has been, and it's never going to be." Do these words sum up the theme of the novel? Why or why not? 16. A search of the Internet reveals that Edith Neisser is a real author, just as Goldman claims. How does this knowledge affect your opinion of Goldman's veracity about the existence of S. Morgenstern and other questions? 17. Is Goldman laughing with his readers, or laughing at them? About the author. William Goldman. "I am an American, Chicago-born," Saul Bellow once wrote, as the opening to his famous novel, The Adventures of Augie March. Same starting-out place for me, Chicago. Michael Reese Hospital nails things down a bit more. August 12th, 1931. I would like to tell you some rollicking early memories, but there are none. I have childhood amnesia. Not all that uncommon. Funny how I found out I had it. I was in New York 40-some years ago, and I started seeing a shrink. The first session, he began trying for a take on my family, asked me about the Chicago days, and as I sat there, I realized they were gone. Couldn't summon anything. I never realized till that moment. My father was a barber, and in 1937 he got an offer to fill the second chair in a little shop off Central in Highland Park, then a small suburb. I didn't have a whole lot of friends, never have, actually, not a whole lot, and was a sports nut, dreaming of myself as this last-minute hero, winning championships for all the Chicago teams, especially the Bears. Me running in the backfield alongside Bronco Nagurski, the greatest who ever lived. Then, the first pneumonia happened, which changed everything, since it was while recovering from it that my father read me S. Morgenstern's masterpiece, The Princess Bride. I think from then on somehow, and you cannot realize how ridiculous an ambition this was, coming from an immigrant barber's son, I wanted to be a storyteller. My parents were both from Florin, the European setting of this novel. They met on the boat over, and they tended to talk to each other in Florinese. I have zero gift for language, and I guess I would have to say maybe because of that, I think I felt pretty much a visitor in my own home. I went to Highland Park High School, got a scholarship to Oberlin College in Ohio, barely made it through. I took a creative writing course at Oberlin, and another one summer at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Got the worst grades in both. So much for storytelling. After I graduated from Oberlin, I went into the Army for 2 years. Now what? What was I going to do with it, my life? I got one job offer to teach high school in Duluth, Minnesota, $2,200 a year to start. I remember being in such despair. I wanted to write. I secretly still wanted to write. All I ever wanted in my life was to tell stories, get the toys over the mountain. And what was going to become of me now, freezing in Minnesota the rest of my days? I was so scared. I'd been writing short stories with never a blink of encouragement. Just plain old, flat-out rejection slips, hundreds of them. Never a note from anyone saying, "Show us your next one," or anything along those lines. I'd never even written anything longer than 15 pages, but I knew I had to go for it. It was now or it would never be. I had to write a novel. I remember thinking somehow to send my mind back to The Princess Bride. I told myself if I could just keep that in my head, the sounds of my father's voice, the way the story unfolded, great-hearted Fezzik and his goofy love of rhymes, Inigo on his hopeless quest, the true lovers, the villains trying to destroy them. Maybe somehow that would give me the confidence to push on. So I clung to those memories. The greatest movie ever, as everyone knows, is Gunga Din, and there is a great cliff sequence in it. 2 reasons I loved it so much. The first, obviously, is because it's so thrilling. But the other, the more important, was this. As I watched it, I was back in my mind seeing Fezzik climb the cliffs of insanity with that strange, dangerous figure in black closing in. I wrote The Temple of Gold in a couple of weeks back in 1956. Knopf published it in 1957. "Still in print," said he. And my dad kept a copy in the shop, and whenever anyone asked about it, he would turn to page 24, where the part about Gunga Din starts, and he would say, "It was not the movie, it was really me." Then he would go on and on about how he read me the Morgenstern, and that had made me the writer I was. And what kind of writer is that? Not for me to answer. 25 books, give or take, double that number of movies, one way or the other. That means doctoring. You can find most of them listed inside. Make of them what you will. Looking back on these words, I can only wonder how my life would have been different all those decades ago if that first pneumonia had wandered down the street, found another house to settle in. Maybe the students in Duluth would have given me a gold watch, and we would never have met. End of The Princess Bride, S. Morgenstern's classic tale of true love and high adventure, the Good Parts version, abridged. By William Goldman. WILLIAM GOLDMAN. Read by Bruce Nelson in the studios of the National Library Service for the Blind and Physically Handicapped for the Library of Congress, June 2005. Published by Ballantine Books, the Ballantine Publishing Group, New York. www.ballantinebooks.com. Further reproduction or distribution in other than a specialized format is prohibited.
End of book.